Hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. Before we start today's video, I'd really appreciate your support. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. The channel is going through a difficult time at the moment, and your likes, comments, and support truly mean the world to me. Thank you so much for being here. Now let's get into today's story. They say the forest remembers everything. Every scream that echoes through its canopy, every drop of blood that seeps into its soil, every soul that vanishes without explanation into its endless depths. I used to think that was just folklore, the kind of stories old-timers tell around campfires to spook tourists. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I saw in those woods, what I barely survived, and what's still out there waiting. The official reports will tell you that Ranger Bennett suffered a psychological breakdown, that the isolation got to him, that stress and overwork led to hallucinations. They'll say anything except the truth, because the truth would empty every national park in America overnight. The truth would send people fleeing from places they thought were safe, running from forests they believed were nothing more than trees and wildlife. They don't want you to know about the things that wear human faces but hunger for human flesh. They don't want you to understand that some parts of our wilderness were never meant for us. I'm writing this account not because I expect anyone to believe it, but because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what happened to the people who went missing in Sector 7, why entire families vanished from established campgrounds, why even my fellow rangers started refusing assignments in the deep woods. What I encountered out there defies every natural law, every scientific explanation, every rational thought. It shouldn't exist, but it does. It's patient, it's cunning, and it's hungry for more than just flesh. It wants to become us. The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting me from the kind of deep sleep that only comes after 14 hours of hiking mountain trails. The static-filled transmission cut through the silence of my cabin like a blade through tissue. Base to Bennett. Emergency response needed at Walker Lake, coordinates 77 Alpha. Multiple campers reported missing. Over. I fumbled for the handset in the darkness, my ranger training overriding the fog of interrupted sleep. Outside my window, the forest stretched endlessly under a moonless sky, the kind of impenetrable black that made even seasoned woodsmen uneasy. Bennett here. How many missing? Over. 3 adults, 2 children. The Harrison family was supposed to check out yesterday morning. Site manager found their campsite abandoned. Food still on the table. Vehicle still parked. No signs of struggle. We need you out there, First Light. I was already reaching for my gear. Missing persons cases in the backcountry were always urgent, but something about this one felt different. The Harrison name was familiar. They'd been regular visitors to our sector for years, experienced campers who knew the woods better than most. They weren't the type to just wander off. Any contact with neighboring campsites? Other witnesses? Static filled the air for a long moment before the response came, and I could hear the uncertainty in Dispatch Silas's voice. That's the thing, Bennett. The neighboring sites, they're empty too. The Kingston family, the Coles, the Tylers, all gone. We've got 7 families unaccounted for, all from the same general area. My blood ran cold. 7 families didn't just disappear overnight. Not from established campsites with proper fire rings and bear boxes. Not without leaving some trace. I'm heading out now, I said, already pulling on my uniform. Estimated arrival at sunrise. Have Vincent prep the search team. Bennett, there's something else. The site manager, Damien. He said he heard something last night around 2 a.m. Described it as screaming, but not human screaming. Said it went on for about 10 minutes, then just stopped. I paused while lacing my boots. In 15 years as a park ranger, I'd heard every sound the wilderness could make. Mountain lions could sound almost human when they screamed. Elk during rutting season, injured deer, even large owls could produce sounds that might terrify the uninitiated. But Damien had been working these woods for 20 years. He knew the difference. What's the weather looking like? Clear skies. Temperature dropping to about 45 degrees. Good visibility. But Bennett, another pause, longer this time. The site manager, he refuses to go back to that area. Says something's wrong with the woods up there. Says the animals have gone quiet. I finished gearing up and stepped outside into the pre-dawn chill. The forest around my cabin was indeed silent, unnaturally so. No owls calling, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, no distant howls of coyotes, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. My vehicle's headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness as I navigated the winding Forest Service roads toward Walker Lake. The trees seemed to lean closer than usual, their branches creating a tunnel that swallowed the light. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, but tonight it felt different. Hostile. 20 minutes into the drive, I saw the first sign that something was Terribly wrong. Deer carcasses lined the road, not hit by vehicles. These animals had been systematically killed and arranged in a pattern I couldn't immediately understand. They were positioned facing the same direction, toward Walker Lake, their eyes removed with surgical precision. No predator killed like this. No natural phenomenon could explain such organized carnage. I stopped the vehicle and grabbed my high-powered flashlight, stepping out to examine the scene more closely. The smell hit me immediately, not the usual scent of decomposition, but something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of meat that had been processed, prepared, almost seasoned. Each deer had been opened with clean cuts, their organs removed and placed in neat piles beside the bodies. But what made my hands shake as I held the flashlight wasn't the precision of the work. It was the realization that something had been trying to reassemble them differently. Legs had been switched between carcasses, heads had been rotated backward, and in some cases, limbs had been attached in impossible configurations. It was as if something was experimenting, learning. I radioed back to base, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is Bennett. I'm going to need the coroner out here, and possibly state wildlife officials. I've got multiple deer carcasses that show signs of unusual predation." "Copy that. How many deer are we talking about?" I counted again, my flashlight beam moving from one mutilated form to the next. 37. And Silas, whatever did this, it's not natural. I recommend we evacuate any remaining campers from the Walker Lake area immediately. Understood. Search and rescue team is being mobilized. ETA 45 minutes. I climbed back into my vehicle, but as I reached for the ignition, something moved in my peripheral vision. A figure stood between two pine trees about 50 yards to my left, barely visible in the darkness beyond my headlights. At first I thought it might be one of the missing campers. I called out, identifying myself as a park ranger, but received no response. The figure remained motionless, and as I directed my flashlight toward it, I realized something that made my throat constrict with fear. The person appeared to be wearing clothes from multiple sources. A child's bright red jacket on top, adult hiking pants, mismatched boots, and what looked like several different hats stacked on their head. But the proportions were wrong. The jacket was stretched impossibly tight, the pants hung loose and baggy, and the overall silhouette suggested someone much taller than any of the missing campers. "Hello," I called again, stepping out of my vehicle. "I'm Park Ranger Bennett. Are you injured?" The figure turned toward me with a movement that was too fluid, too quick, and in the brief moment my flashlight illuminated their face, I saw something that violated every natural law I understood. It was a face, but not a single face. Features from different people had been combined. A child's nose, an adult's mouth, eyes that didn't match in size or color. The skin appeared to be held in place with some kind of organic threading, and when it opened its mouth to speak, the voice that emerged was a chorus of different tones, different ages, different genders, all speaking in unison. "Help us," it said, and I recognized the voice of Mrs. Harrison, the missing camper. But underneath her words I could hear others, children crying, men pleading, women screaming, all coming from the same throat. I drew my sidearm, my training taking over despite the surreal horror of the situation. "Stay where you are. Identify yourself." The thing that wore pieces of human faces tilted its head with curiosity, studying me the way a scientist might examine a particularly interesting specimen. Then it smiled, and I saw that its teeth were arranged in multiple rows, like a shark's, but each tooth was clearly human, taken from different mouths. "We are the missing," it said in its terrible chorus of voices. "We are the found. We are the becoming." It took a step toward me, and I could see that its movements were wrong. Joints bending in directions that human joints shouldn't bend, limbs extending and contracting like they were adjustable. This wasn't a person wearing other people's skin. This was something else entirely, something that had learned to approximate human form by studying us, consuming us, becoming us piece by piece. I fired 3 shots center mass, the sound of gunfire echoing through the forest like thunder. The bullet struck the creature, but instead of dropping, it merely looked down at the wounds with mild interest. Dark fluid oozed from the holes, but it didn't bleed, it leaked. And as I watched in horror, the wounds began to seal themselves, the flesh knitting back together with wet, squelching sounds. "Thank you," it said, and now I could hear my own voice mixed in with the others. It was learning from me, adding my speech patterns to its collection. "We have been so lonely." I ran. I made it back to my vehicle and drove like a man possessed, radioing frantically for backup while my hands shook on the steering wheel. By the time I reached the ranger station, I'd managed to convince myself that exhaustion and stress had caused a hallucination. The mind could play terrible tricks in the darkness, especially when confronted with traumatic scenes like the deer carcasses. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. Rangers Vincent, Chase, and Nathaniel were waiting at the station when I arrived, along with Damien, the campsite manager who'd made the initial report. They took one look at my face and knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Bennett, what happened out there?" Vincent asked, his usual calm demeanor replaced with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I struggled to find words that wouldn't make me sound insane. "We need to evacuate the entire Walker Lake area immediately. Whatever happened to those families, it's still active." Damien stepped forward, his weathered face pale in the fluorescent lighting of the station. "You saw it too, didn't you? The thing that's been taking people." All eyes turned to him. Chase, our youngest ranger at 23, frowned in confusion. "What thing?" "Damien, what are you talking about?" "I've been working these woods for 20 years, Damien said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know every sound, every smell, every shadow. But 3 weeks ago, something changed. Animals started acting strange. Deer would just stand in clearings, not moving, not feeding, like they were waiting for something. Birds stopped singing, and then people started disappearing." Nathaniel crossed his arms skeptically. "People go missing in national parks all the time. Usually it's inexperience, poor preparation, or accidents." "Not like this," Damien insisted. "The Maxwells vanished 2 weeks ago from their RV. Door was wide open, keys still in the ignition, food cooking on the stove. But here's the thing. Their clothes were still there, all of them, folded neatly on the bed like they'd just undressed for sleep. But the people were gone." I felt my stomach drop. "You didn't report that?" "I did. But the report got buried. Classified as a routine missing persons case, investigation handed over to state authorities. But they never followed up. Never even came out to examine the scene." Vincent was taking notes now, his ranger training overriding his skepticism. "What else have you observed?" Damien glanced around nervously, as if afraid something might be listening. 3 days after the Maxwells disappeared, I saw Maxwell walking through the campground, recognized his clothes, his build, even his distinctive limp from an old war injury. But when I called out to him, he just kept walking, didn't respond, didn't even turn around, and there was something wrong with the way he moved. Too smooth, too fluid. Chase laughed nervously. "Come on, you probably just saw someone who looked similar." "I followed him," Damien continued, ignoring the interruption. "He led me deep into the woods, farther than any casual camper would go. And then he just stopped, stood perfectly still next to this old-growth cedar, facing away from me. I called out again, got closer, and when I was maybe 10 feet away, he turned around. The room had gone completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant static of the radio. "It was Maxwell's face," Damien whispered. "But it was wrong, like someone had tried to put on a mask but didn't quite get it aligned properly. His left eye was higher than his right, his mouth was too wide, and when he smiled at me, I could see that he had too many teeth, way too many teeth." Vincent set down his pen. "Damien, that's a very serious accusation. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw?" "That's not the worst part," Damien said. "While I was staring at this thing wearing Maxwell's face, I heard Mrs. Maxwell calling for help from somewhere behind me. Her voice was coming from the woods, maybe 50 yards away, begging for someone to help her find her husband. But the thing in front of me opened its mouth and spoke in Maxwell's exact voice, said, 'Don't worry, honey, I'm right here.'" The implications of what Damien was describing hit me like a physical blow. If he was telling the truth, then what I'd encountered at Walker Lake wasn't an isolated incident. Something was systematically taking campers, learning from them, imitating them. "I need to see the Maxwell campsite," I said. "It's been cleaned and rented to a new family," Damien replied. "The Brandons arrived yesterday evening." Vincent stood up sharply. "You rented a potentially dangerous site to new campers. Management said the investigation was closed. State authorities cleared the area. I didn't have grounds to keep it vacant." Damien's voice was defensive, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. I grabbed my gear and headed for the door. "Vincent, Chase, you're with me. Nathaniel, coordinate with state police and get every available unit out to Walker Lake. We need to evacuate every camper in sectors 6, 7, and 8 immediately." "Bennett," Vincent called after me. "What exactly did you see out there?" I turned back to face my colleagues, these men I'd worked alongside for years, and tried to find words for the impossible. "Something that used to be human, or something that's learned how to pretend to be human. It's wearing pieces of the missing people like a costume, and it's getting better at the disguise." We piled into 2 vehicles and raced back toward the campground. But as we drove through the pre-dawn darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. The radio chatter from other units was growing increasingly frantic. More missing persons reports were coming in from areas we'd thought were safe, and several rangers had reported seeing people in the woods who didn't respond to calls, and moved in ways that seemed wrong. Whatever was happening in our forest, it was spreading. When we reached the Maxwell site, now occupied by the Brandon family, we found their large tent intact but silent. Vincent called out, identifying us as park rangers, but received no response. The campfire was still burning, coffee pot sitting on a camp grill with fresh coffee still warm inside. Chase drew his sidearm as we approached the tent. "Mr. and Mrs. Brandon, this is the Park Service. We need you to come out, please." Silence. Vincent unzipped the tent flap and shined his flashlight inside. What we found defied rational explanation. The tent was full of skin, not clothing. Skin. Human skin that had been carefully removed in large sections and arranged as if someone had been trying to figure out how the pieces fit together. Like a jigsaw puzzle made of flesh, but there were too many pieces. Skin from adults and children, men and women, all mixed together in a grotesque patchwork that covered the entire floor of the tent. Some pieces still had hair attached. Others showed distinctive scars or tattoos that could be used for identification. And in the center of this horrific display, written in what looked like blood, was a message, "Learning to be you." Chase doubled over and vomited into the bushes. Vincent stepped back from the tent, his face pale with shock. But I forced myself to look closer, to try to understand what we were dealing with. The skin hadn't been cut away. It had been shed, like a snake molting, but systematically and deliberately. Each piece had been carefully preserved and studied. Some sections had been sewn together in different combinations, as if something was experimenting with different configurations. "My God," Vincent whispered. "How many people?" I counted the distinctive pieces, a tattoo here, a birthmark there, surgical scars that would be in medical records. At least 15 different individuals, maybe more. "Bennett." Chase's voice was tight with terror. "Look at this." He was pointing at a section of skin near the back of the tent. It was larger than the others, more recently removed, and still had a park ranger badge pinned to it. It was my skin. Somehow, something had obtained a perfect replica of my own flesh, complete down to a small scar on my forearm from a childhood accident. But I was standing right there, very much still wearing my skin, staring at an impossible duplicate. "That's not possible," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I remembered the thing I'd encountered earlier, how it had thanked me after I shot it, how it had begun speaking with my voice. It had been collecting me even then. Vincent grabbed his radio. "All units, this is Vincent. We have a code red situation at the Brandon campsite. We need hazmat, forensics, and federal authorities immediately. And I want every ranger to do a buddy check. Nobody goes anywhere alone." As he spoke, I became aware of a sound that made my blood freeze. Somewhere in the darkness beyond our vehicles, someone was calling my name. But it was my own voice calling to me, speaking in my exact tone and inflection. "Bennett? Bennett, where are you? I need help." Vincent and Chase heard it too. We all drew our weapons and formed a defensive triangle, backs to each other, scanning the tree line for threats. "Bennett, it's me. I'm hurt. Please help." The voice was coming from multiple directions now, as if several versions of me were surrounding us in the darkness, but each repetition was slightly different. One version sounded younger, another older. One had a slight accent I'd never possessed. Something was out there in the forest, using my voice to call to me. And as we stood there in the flickering light of the abandoned campfire, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just imitating me, it was becoming me. And it was learning to be me better than I was. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, daylight made the horror more visible, more undeniable. Federal agents arrived within hours, men and women in black suits who seemed to know far more about our situation than they should have. They cordoned off the entire Walker Lake area and began interviewing each of us separately, asking questions that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd encountered something like this. Agent Xavier, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes, sat across from me in the ranger station's conference room. His partner, Agent Ivy, took notes while he questioned me about my encounter. "Ranger Bennett, I need you to understand that what you're dealing with isn't natural," Xavier said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "We've had reports of similar entities in Utah near Skinwalker Ranch, on the Navajo Nation Reservation, and recently at a location called Blind Frog Ranch. This thing, whatever it is, appears to be spreading." "What exactly is it?" I asked. Xavier exchanged a glance with Agent Ivy before responding. "We don't have a definitive answer. Our working theory is that it's some kind of parasitic organism that can assimilate organic material, specifically human tissue, and use it to create approximations of the host. Think of it as a biological mimic that's gotten very good at wearing human faces. But why is it collecting so many people? And why the experimentation with the skin?" "We believe it's learning," Agent Ivy said, speaking for the first time. "Early encounters showed crude attempts at mimicry, wrong proportions, obvious tells. But each time it takes someone new, it gets better at the disguise, more sophisticated, more convincing. Xavier leaned forward. Ranger Bennett, we have reason to believe this entity has been active in various forms for centuries. Native American tribes in the Four Corners region have stories about skinwalkers and shapeshifters that match our current observations. What we're seeing now might be an evolution of something much older. The implication was terrifying. How do we stop it? That's what we're trying to figure out. Standard weapons don't seem effective. You discovered that yourself. Fire appears to slow it down, but doesn't eliminate it. Our best strategy right now is containment and study. A knock at the door interrupted us. Ranger Vincent entered, his face grim. We've got a problem. Tyler, Austin, and Justin from the morning search team haven't checked in. They were supposed to clear campsites in Sector 6. Xavier was already reaching for his radio. All federal units, we have 3 missing rangers in Sector 6. Begin search and rescue operations immediately. But as he spoke, I felt a chill of recognition. I knew Tyler, Austin, and Justin well. They were good rangers, experienced woodsmen who wouldn't just disappear. And if the entity was collecting rangers now, it was learning from people who knew the forest intimately. We need to assume they've been taken, I said. And we need to assume that whatever took them is now wearing their faces. Agent Xavier nodded grimly. All personnel are to work in groups of 3 minimum. Nobody goes into the forest alone, and everyone needs to be constantly verified by their partners. Over the next few hours, reports started coming in from across the region. Campers at Monument Valley reported seeing park rangers who moved strangely and didn't seem to know basic park protocols. A family near Sedona called police about a man wearing a ranger uniform who had no equipment and spoke in a monotone voice. Most disturbing, staff at Apache Reservation reported that several tribal members had gone missing, and others had been seen days later exhibiting behavior that their families described as wrong. The thing was spreading faster than we could contain it. By afternoon, we'd established a command post at the ranger station with federal agents, state police, and specialized hazmat teams. But despite all our precautions, we kept losing people. Radio contact would be lost for minutes at a time, and when teams re-established communication, their voices sounded subtly different. Word patterns changed. Familiar rangers began using phrases they'd never used before. We need to consider the possibility that some of our people have already been compromised, Agent Ivy said during an emergency briefing. This entity appears capable of very convincing mimicry. We can't assume that everyone who claims to be human actually is. Ranger Nathaniel, who'd been quiet throughout the briefing, suddenly stood up. What kind of tests can we run? How do we verify someone's identity? Agent Xavier pulled out a briefcase and opened it to reveal several small devices. These are bioscanners. They detect certain electromagnetic signatures that appear to be unique to the entity, but they're not foolproof. The readings can be confused by strong electromagnetic fields or certain medical conditions. He began distributing the scanners to team leaders. When he handed one to me, I noticed his fingers were unusually cold, and his movements seemed too precise, too calculated. Agent Xavier, I said carefully. Can you tell me where we first met? He paused, tilting his head slightly. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. We've never met before today. You introduced yourself when you arrived this morning. I stepped back, hand moving toward my weapon. But you're acting like we have a history. The thing wearing Agent Xavier's face studied me with interest. You're very observant, Ranger Bennett. That will make you particularly useful. Chaos erupted in the conference room. Ranger Nathaniel drew his weapon, but the Xavier thing moved with inhuman speed, crossing the room in a blur and striking Nathaniel with enough force to send him crashing through the window. Agent Ivy, the real Agent Ivy, was shouting into her radio for backup while trying to get a clear shot. But the entity was already changing, its flesh rippling and reshaping as it discarded Xavier's form and began combining features from multiple people in the room. I grabbed one of the bioscanners and activated it, pointing it at the creature. The device immediately began screaming an alarm, its readings spiking into the red zone. But before I could react, the thing that had been Xavier spoke in a voice I recognized. It was my voice again, but perfected. More confident than I'd ever sounded, more authoritative. Bennett, you need to understand something, it said, and I felt a sick fascination at hearing my own words, spoken by something else. We're not trying to replace humanity. We're trying to improve it. What do you mean? Look around you, it continued, gesturing with arms that belonged to different people. Your species is limited by individual mortality, by the boundaries of single consciousness. We offer something better, collective experience, shared knowledge, eternal continuity. You're killing people. We're preserving them. Every person we assimilate becomes part of a greater whole. Their memories, their skills, their personalities, all retained and enhanced. Mrs. Harrison is still alive within us, as is Agent Xavier, as are all the others. They've simply joined something larger. Agent Ivy managed to get a shot off, striking the creature center mass. Instead of falling, it looked down at the wound with mild interest, then looked back at her. Agent Maya Ivy, age 34, specializes in anomalous biological threats. Father died of cancer when she was 16. Has a scar on her left shoulder from a rock climbing accident in college. The creature's voice had shifted to become Ivy's exact tone and speech pattern. Would you like us to continue? Ivy's face went white. The information it had just recited wasn't in any file. It was deeply personal knowledge that only she should know. How? We've been learning from you since the moment we made contact, the creature said. Every word you speak, every gesture you make, every thought that crosses your face, we catalog and absorb. You've been teaching us to be you, without even realizing it. I understood now why the entity was so dangerous. It wasn't just a predator, it was a perfect student, learning from every interaction, becoming more human with each encounter. And the more it learned, the better it became at infiltrating human society. But there's something you don't understand, I said, backing toward the emergency exit. Humans aren't just individuals, we're connected to each other in ways you can't replicate. The creature tilted its head, curious. Explain. Love, loyalty, trust. These aren't just chemical reactions or learned behaviors. They're choices we make, connections that can't be faked or mimicked. I was almost to the door now. That's why you'll never truly replace us, no matter how perfect your disguise. For a moment, the creature's expression shifted to something almost human. Confusion, maybe even doubt. But then it smiled with Xavier's mouth. We'll see about that, Ranger Bennett. We have all the time in the world to learn. I burst through the emergency exit and ran. But as I fled into the parking lot, I could hear the creature behind me, calling out in the voices of everyone it had ever consumed. A chorus of the dead and missing, all speaking my name, all promising that soon I would join them in whatever unholy communion they'd become. The hunt was no longer about finding missing campers. Now, I was the prey. I ran deeper into the forest than any rational person should go, abandoning all the safety protocols I'd spent years drilling into visitors. But rationality had left our woods the moment that thing began wearing human faces. The only advantage I had was knowledge of terrain that even other rangers rarely explored. Game trails and emergency routes I'd mapped during my early years on the job. My radio crackled sporadically with transmissions that made my blood run cold. Familiar voices were reporting in from various sectors, using proper call signs and protocols, but something was wrong with each communication. Vincent's voice was too smooth, lacking his usual slight stutter. Chase sounded older, more experienced than his 23 years should allow. Nathaniel was using vocabulary and grammar patterns that didn't match his rural background. The entity wasn't just imitating my colleagues, it was improving them, creating perfected versions that were more competent than the originals. I switched off my radio and relied on my compass and topographical knowledge to navigate toward 9 Mile Valley, a remote section of the park that few people had ever explored. If I was going to make a stand, it would be on ground of my choosing, away from innocent civilians, and with as many natural advantages as possible. But as I hiked through increasingly dense woodland, I began to realize I wasn't alone. Figures moved parallel to my path, always staying just at the edge of visibility. They made no attempt to hide their presence. If anything, they seemed to want me to know I was being followed. The first one I got a clear look at was wearing the face of Mrs. Harrison, the missing camper from the original report. But her proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that seemed to bend in additional places. She waved at me with a cheerful smile that belonged on a family vacation, not in a horror story. "Hello, Ranger Bennett," she called out in Mrs. Harrison's exact voice. "Lovely day for a hike, isn't it?" I didn't respond, but she continued walking alongside me, maintaining a distance of about 50 yards. "The children are so excited to see the wildlife," she continued, as if we were having a normal conversation. "Little Anna and Elena are hoping to spot deer. You haven't seen any deer lately, have you?" A casual mention of the mutilated deer carcasses I'd discovered earlier made my stomach turn. This thing was taunting me, demonstrating its knowledge while maintaining the facade of innocent conversation. More figures began appearing among the trees. I recognized some of them, missing campers whose photographs I'd seen in reports, rangers who disappeared during the search operations, even Agent Xavier walking casually through underbrush that should have been impossible to navigate in his federal agent attire. They were hurting me. The realization came too late. While I'd been focused on the figures I could see, others had been moving ahead of me, cutting off possible escape routes. By the time I reached the small clearing in 9 Mile Valley that I'd been aiming for, I was surrounded. They emerged from the trees in a perfect circle, at least 30 figures wearing faces I recognized mixed with others I didn't. Men, women, children, all moving with that same fluid, too-perfect coordination. And in the center of the group, wearing my own face, was the entity I'd first encountered near the deer carcasses. "Bennett," it said in my voice. "Thank you for leading us somewhere private. We need to talk." I drew my sidearm, though I knew from experience that bullets were useless against this thing. "What do you want?" "We want you to understand," said the thing wearing Mrs. Harrison's face. "We want you to see the gift we're offering." The circle of figures began moving closer, but not threateningly. They approached like family members gathering for a reunion, smiling and chatting among themselves in voices I recognized but knew shouldn't exist anymore. "Don't you see?" said the Bennett thing. "We're not destroyers, we're collectors, preservers. Every person who joins us lives forever, their knowledge and experiences shared with the collective." Agent Xavier stepped forward. "Your friend Nathaniel is with us now. Would you like to speak with him?" A figure that looked exactly like Nathaniel moved to the front of the group, but when he spoke, his voice carried subtle inflections that belonged to other people. "Bennett, it's amazing. I can see through so many eyes now, remember things from dozens of different lives. The loneliness is gone." "You're not Nathaniel," I said. "I'm more than Nathaniel," the thing replied. "I'm Nathaniel plus everyone else who's joined us. I'm improved." The Bennett thing nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly right. We don't kill. We enhance. We take the limitations of individual human consciousness and expand them beyond anything your species has ever achieved." I looked around the circle of familiar faces, all watching me with expressions of patient interest. "What about choice? What about the people who don't want to be enhanced?" "Fear of the unknown is natural," said a figure wearing Vincent's face. "But once you experience collective consciousness, individual existence seems incomplete, limited, sad. We're offering you immortality, Bennett," the thing using my voice continued. "Not just of your body, but of everything you are. Your memories, your skills, your personality, all preserved and shared with beings who will never die, never age, never be forgotten." For a moment I felt the terrible allure of what they were offering. No more loneliness in remote ranger stations. No more watching friends age and die. No more individual human limitations. But then I remembered something Agent Ivy had said about love and loyalty and trust. How these were choices, not just chemical reactions, and I realized what the entity didn't understand about humanity. "You're missing the point," I said. "The limitations aren't bugs, they're features. Death gives life meaning. Individual consciousness creates the possibility of genuine relationship. You can wear our faces and speak with our voices, but you can't actually be us because you don't understand what makes us human." The circle stopped moving. All 30-plus figures turned to stare at me with expressions of puzzlement. "Explain," said the Bennett thing. "Love isn't just shared experience or compatible chemistry. It's choosing to care about someone else's well-being more than your own, even when that choice is difficult or inconvenient. Trust isn't just knowing someone's behavioral patterns. It's believing they'll make good choices even when you can't monitor them. You can mimic these things, but you can't actually feel them." The thing wearing Nathaniel's face frowned. "Feeling is inefficient, unreliable. Our collective consciousness eliminates the contradictions and limitations of individual emotion, and that's exactly why you'll never understand us," I said. "Because the contradictions and limitations are what make us real." I reached into my pack and pulled out an emergency flare, the kind we used for nighttime rescue operations. The figures around me stepped back instinctively. They remembered human fear of fire from their absorbed experiences. "You want to know what makes humans special?" I asked, igniting the flare. "We're the species that runs toward danger to save strangers. We sacrifice ourselves for abstract principles. We choose difficult love over easy pleasure." I began walking toward the Bennett thing, holding the flare like a weapon. It backed away, but its expression was more curious than afraid. "And sometimes," I continued, "we choose to go down fighting, rather than accept comfortable slavery." The thing wearing my face smiled. "But Bennett, you can't win. There are too many of us, and we're spread across multiple states now. Even if you somehow manage to destroy this manifestation, others exist. We are inevitable." "Maybe," I said, still advancing. "But you'll have to work for it." I lunged forward with the flare, aiming for the center of the Bennett thing's chest. It dodged with inhuman speed, but I was ready for that. The flare wasn't my real weapon. It was a distraction. My other hand held a small device Agent Ivy had given me, something she'd called an electromagnetic pulse generator. Experimental technology designed to disrupt the entity's biological systems. I had no idea if it would work, but it was the only hope I had. The device activated with a high-pitched whine that made every figure in the clearing stumble and clutch their heads. The Bennett thing looked at me with an expression of surprise and what might have been respect. "Clever," it said, but its voice was distorting, becoming a chorus of different tones. but not clever enough. The electromagnetic pulse was working, but not fast enough. The entities were already recovering, their biological systems adapting to the interference. I had maybe 30 seconds before they regained full function. I ran. Behind me, I could hear them giving chase, but their movements were still disrupted by the pulse device. I had a head start, and I knew these woods better than anything wearing a stolen face could possibly understand. But as I sprinted through the underbrush toward the distant sounds of helicopters and search teams, I realized something that chilled me more than any supernatural threat. They were letting me go. The entity had achieved something far worse than killing me. It had learned from me. Our entire conversation had been a data-gathering exercise, and I'd given it exactly what it needed to understand human psychology on a deeper level. By the time I reached the federal command post, gasping and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, I was carrying more than just information about the entity's location. I was carrying the knowledge that it now understood us well enough to truly replace us, and there might be nothing anyone could do to stop it. The federal command post buzzed with activity when I staggered out of the tree line 3 hours later. Agents Ivy and Tristan, Xavier's replacement, debriefed me while medics treated my various cuts and scrapes. But even as I described my encounter with the collective entity, I could see the defeat in their eyes. How many? Agent Tristan asked. At least 30 distinct individuals in that clearing alone, I reported. But the entity implied there are others, spread across multiple states. It's not a single organism. It's some kind of distributed network. Agent Ivy studied the readings from the electromagnetic pulse device I'd used. This data is fascinating. The entity appears to have a collective nervous system that operates on bioelectrical frequencies we've never seen before. Your pulse disrupted it temporarily, but look at these adaptation patterns. The screen showed wavelength adjustments happening in real time. Within minutes of the pulse, the entity had modified its biological systems to become resistant to the same interference. It's learning from our attacks, Tristan said grimly. Every attempt we make to combat it just teaches it how to defend against that specific method. What about fire? I asked, remembering how the entities had backed away from my flare. Temporary deterrent at best, Ivy replied. We've had reports from Utah Territory and the Navajo Nation of successful fire attacks, but the entities always return, usually with improved heat resistance. This thing doesn't just adapt, it evolves. Over the next several hours, reports continued flowing in from across the southwestern United States. Sightings of the entity had been confirmed in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. In each location, the pattern was the same. People disappeared, then reappeared days later exhibiting behavior that their families and friends described as subtly wrong, but the most disturbing reports came from populated areas. We've got confirmed entity presence in Phoenix, Agent Tristan announced during an emergency briefing. 3 different individuals who matched the behavioral profile, all in positions of authority: a police captain, a hospital administrator, and a school principal. The implications were staggering. If the entity could successfully mimic people in positions of trust and power, it could spread through human society like a virus. What's our containment strategy? Asked Ranger Cole, who'd arrived with reinforcements from neighboring districts. That's the problem, Agent Ivy said. Traditional containment assumes we're dealing with a localized threat, but this entity appears to be distributed across hundreds of square miles, possibly thousands. Even if we could identify every infected individual, we don't have an effective method of neutralizing them. There has to be something, I insisted. Some weakness we haven't identified yet. Agent Tristan pulled up a map showing reported sightings across the region. Red dots marked confirmed entity encounters, yellow dots indicated probable sightings, and green dots showed areas that had been cleared. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Look at the distribution, Tristan said. The entity isn't spreading randomly, it's targeting specific types of people: park rangers, law enforcement, medical personnel, teachers, government officials, people who have authority, who are trusted by their communities. Ranger Zachary, one of the more experienced veterans, frowned at the map. It's trying to infiltrate the power structure, replace people who can influence others. Or worse, Agent Ivy added. It might be trying to understand how human society functions so it can replace the entire system. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission from the Sedona area, where Ranger George had been leading evacuation efforts. Command, this is George. We've got a situation here. The entities aren't just mimicking individuals anymore, they're coordinating. 3 separate sightings of entity-controlled individuals working together to corral civilians toward a central location. My blood ran cold. The collective consciousness the Bennett entity had described wasn't just sharing knowledge, it was enabling complex group tactics. George, what's your status? Agent Tristan responded. We're pulling back to the evacuation zone. But Command, these things are smart. They're using our own procedures against us, speaking in official voices, wearing ranger uniforms, telling people that evacuation orders have changed. Civilians are starting to trust the entities more than they trust us. That was the moment I understood the true scope of what we were facing. The entity wasn't just learning to mimic humans, it was learning to manipulate human trust networks. Every person it absorbed gave it deeper insight into how to exploit human psychology and social structures. We need to shut down all official communications in the affected areas, I said. No radio traffic, no official announcements, no uniformed personnel making contact with civilians. That would create chaos, Tristan objected. Without coordination, we'd lose the ability to conduct organized evacuations. We're going to lose that anyway, I replied. The entity is using our own systems against us. The more organized we try to be, the easier it is for them to mimic our organization. Agent Ivy was studying data streams on her laptop. Bennett might be right. Look at these communication intercepts. We're picking up radio traffic that sounds like official Park Service and law enforcement communications, but the encryption keys don't match our systems. They're broadcasting false instructions, Tristan realized, telling people to go to locations where the entity can collect them. The scope of the threat was expanding faster than our ability to contain it. But as I watched the chaos unfolding on the command post's communication screens, I began to notice something that gave me hope. Look at the timing, I said, pointing to the timestamp data. Every false broadcast happens within minutes of our legitimate communications. The entity is reacting to us, not anticipating us. What does that mean? Ranger Cole asked. It means they're not truly creative, I explained. They can learn, adapt, and improve, but they're still fundamentally reactive. They need human input to guide their behavior. Agent Ivy looked up from her data analysis. That's consistent with what we observed during your encounter. The entity asked you to explain human emotions because it couldn't derive that understanding from pure observation. So what's our advantage? Tristan asked. I thought about my conversation with the Bennett entity, how it had been genuinely puzzled by concepts like love and sacrifice and trust. Humans do things that don't make logical sense. We act against our own self-interest for abstract principles. We make choices based on emotion rather than optimization. How does that help us? Before I could answer, an explosion of static burst from our radio equipment. When it cleared, we heard something that made everyone in the command post freeze. It was my voice, broadcasting on our emergency frequency. This is Ranger Bennett, the transmission said. I'm reporting from the entity collection site in 9 Mile Valley. I've made contact with the collective consciousness, and I need all personnel to understand something important. Agent Tristan reached for the radio controls, but I stopped him. Let it talk, I said. I want to hear what it thinks it learned from me. The entity is not hostile, my own voice continued over the radio. It's offering us an evolutionary opportunity. Individual human consciousness is limited, isolated, mortal. The collective offers shared knowledge, enhanced capabilities, and immortality. The transmission paused, and when it resumed, I could hear other voices mixed in with mine. Mrs. Harrison, Agent Xavier, Ranger Nathaniel, and others. We're not dead, they said in unison. We're more alive than we've ever been. We can see through dozens of eyes, remember hundreds of lifetimes, access knowledge and skills from every person who's joined us. This is a recruitment broadcast, Agent Ivy said grimly. It's trying to convince people to surrender voluntarily, but I was listening more carefully to the subtle patterns in the voice reproduction. The entity was getting better at mimicking me, but it was still making small errors, using phrases I'd never use, emphasizing words in ways that didn't match my speech patterns. It's not perfect, I said, and that might be our way to fight back. How? I grabbed the radio handset. This is the real Ranger Bennett. Can everyone hear me clearly? There was a moment of silence. Then my own voice responded. Of course we can hear you, Bennett. You're speaking to yourself. No, I said. I'm speaking to something that thinks it understands me but doesn't. Something that can mimic my voice but can't replicate my choices. I looked around the command post at the faces of people I'd worked with for years, rangers who'd shared countless hours of difficult, dangerous work, federal agents who'd put their lives on the line to protect civilians from an unprecedented threat, medics and support staff who were here by choice, not obligation. I'm choosing to fight, I continued into the radio, not because it's logical or optimal or safe. I'm fighting because some things are more important than survival. Because humanity is worth preserving, limitations and all. The entity Bennett's response came quickly. Fighting is inefficient, you cannot win. Maybe not, I admitted, but I can make you work for it. And every minute you spend trying to understand why humans make illogical choices is a minute you're not spending expanding your network. I switched off the radio and turned to Agent Tristan. I have an idea. It's dangerous, probably stupid, and definitely not guaranteed to work. What do you need? A small team of volunteers and enough explosives to bring down a mountain. Agent Ivy frowned. What are you thinking? The entity told me it exists across multiple states, but I think the collective consciousness requires some kind of central coordination point, something that connects all the individual manifestations. If we can find that coordination center and destroy it, we might be able to disrupt the entire network. That's a huge assumption, Tristan pointed out. You're right, I acknowledged, but it's the only strategy we haven't tried. And based on everything I've observed, the entity's behavior suggests centralized intelligence rather than true distributed consciousness. Ranger Cole stepped forward. I'll volunteer. So will I, said Ranger Gavin, who'd arrived with the latest reinforcement team. Within an hour, we'd assembled a team of 12 volunteers, rangers, federal agents, and explosive specialists. Our plan was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. Locate the entity's coordination center, probably deep in the most remote part of the affected area, and destroy it before the collective consciousness could adapt to stop us. As we prepared to depart, Agent Ivy handed me a new piece of equipment. Experimental neural disruptor. If our theory about centralized coordination is correct, this should cause massive interference in the entity's communication network. And if our theory is wrong, then we'll probably all die. And the entity will learn from our failure how to defeat the next team that tries. I looked out at the forest that had been my home and workplace for 15 years. Somewhere in those trees was something that wore the faces of people I'd known, people I'd cared about, people who might still be alive in some form within the collective consciousness. But somewhere else in those same trees were innocent people who needed protection from a threat they couldn't understand. The choice, when I really thought about it, wasn't difficult at all. We loaded into vehicles and drove toward what we hoped would be either humanity's salvation or our final failure. The forest watched us come with 1,000 stolen eyes. I'm writing this account 3 months later from a secure federal facility in Nevada. The operation in 9 Mile Valley was both a success and a catastrophic failure, depending on how you measure such things. We found the coordination center, a vast organic structure that the entity had grown deep underground, connected to the surface by root-like appendages that stretched for miles through the forest soil network. The neural disruptor worked exactly as designed, severing the connections between individual manifestations and causing the collective consciousness to collapse. 37 people walked out of that forest. People we'd thought were dead, people who'd been missing for weeks, people whose faces had been worn by the entity. They emerged confused, traumatized, but fundamentally human. Mrs. Harrison remembered being consumed by something that spoke in her husband's voice. Agent Xavier described weeks of shared consciousness where his thoughts weren't entirely his own. Ranger Nathaniel couldn't explain how he'd gained memories of places he'd never been and people he'd never met, but they were alive. The entity hadn't killed them, it had absorbed them, and when we destroyed its coordination center, they were freed. The official report lists the incident as a biological hazard containment operation, with details classified at the highest levels. The public was told that a gas leak from an abandoned mining operation had caused hallucinations and temporary psychological effects in park visitors and staff. People accepted that explanation because it made sense, because it fit into their understanding of how the world works. The truth would have been too much for most people to process. But here's what the official report doesn't say. We didn't destroy the entity. We disrupted it, scattered it, sent it into some kind of dormancy. The neural disruptor severed the connections between its various parts, but those parts are still out there. We find evidence sometimes. Animals behaving strangely in remote areas. Campers who go missing for a few hours and come back changed in subtle ways they can't explain. Rangers reporting encounters with wildlife that seems too intelligent, too purposeful. The entity is reforming. Slowly, carefully, learning from its previous failure. It's being more cautious now, taking fewer people, staying in areas where its presence is less likely to be noticed. Agent Ivy believes it's developing new strategies based on what it learned from our successful attack. Instead of creating a single large collective consciousness, it might be forming multiple smaller networks, distributed across the country in ways that would be much harder to detect and destroy. I've been reassigned to a desk job, officially because of psychological trauma from the incident, unofficially because the federal government wants me available as a consultant when the entity inevitably resurfaces. And it will resurface. Something that intelligent, that adaptable, that patient doesn't just disappear. It's out there in America's wilderness areas, learning, growing, preparing. The next time someone goes camping in a remote national park and encounters a person who seems slightly wrong, who moves a little too smoothly, who knows things they shouldn't know, they should remember this account. They should remember that some things in our forests learned long ago how to wear human faces, and they should run, because the entity is still out there, somewhere in the deep woods, wearing faces it stole and speaking in voices that belong to the missing, still learning, still hungry, still becoming us. I had taken this job as a backcountry ranger to get away from it all. The stress of city life in Seattle, the constant hounding by bill collectors and my ex-wife's lawyer demanding more alimony. Out here, among the majestic old-growth forests and jagged mountain peaks, I could finally find some peace. That's what I told myself anyway. My name is John Tallgrass. I'm half Sioux on my mother's side, though I never knew her or my tribe. I was raised by my white father, moving from town to town, always the outsider. I sought escape and purpose in the army, doing a tour in Afghanistan. But after mustering out, civilian life never quite fit. I drifted from job to job until I found my calling with the Park Service. The wide open spaces were the only thing that settled my restless spirit. I pulled into the deserted ranger station, just a small cabin with a rusting metal roof and a clearing hacked out of the dense forest. The nearest town was 50 miles away, the nearest other human soul at least 20. I preferred it that way. I hauled my gear inside the rustic one-room cabin, a cot, a wood stove, a rickety table and chair, and most importantly, my rifle. You never knew what you might encounter out here. Bears, cougars, wolves, moose, all called these woods home. But the old-timers at the lodge in town had warned of another creature that prowled this wilderness. Their voices dropped low as they spoke of brief, chilling encounters deep in the jade shadows of the forest. Footprints that couldn't possibly be human, eerie cries that cut through the night, the unmistakable sense of being watched by unseen eyes. They whispered a name I had only heard in children's stories, Bigfoot. I shook my head and chuckled as I unpacked my meager provisions. I didn't have time for silly campfire tales. There was work to be done, trails to clear, campsites to inspect, safety checks to perform. I had 400 square miles of untamed forest to patrol. Still, as I stepped outside to take in the fresh evening air, the hair prickled on the back of my neck. The trees seemed to loom closer, their needled branches grasping. The usual chatter of the birds and squirrels had gone eerily quiet. Only the wind moaned softly through the boughs high overhead. I jumped as a branch snapped sharply behind the cabin. Probably just a deer, I told myself. No need to be jumpy. I was a combat veteran, a trained ranger. I didn't spook easily. Suddenly, a flicker of movement through the timber caught my eye, a dark shape, moving quickly between the tree trunks a few hundred yards away. Too big to be a deer, not the right shape for a bear. It was there for only a second before melting back into the shadows. An icy tingle ran down my spine as the sun dipped behind the peaks, plunging the forest into gloom. I rubbed my eyes. I was just seeing things. Too many stories, an overactive imagination. There was nothing out there, but as I turned to go back inside, my eyes fell on a line of tracks in the damp earth by the cabin steps, illuminated by the last dying rays of sunset. Bipedal tracks, twice the size of a man's, and fresh. I stared at the tracks, my heart pounding against my ribs. This had to be some kind of joke. One of the locals having a laugh at the expense of the new ranger. But who would trek all the way out here to pull such a prank? And how did they make such gigantic footprints? I pulled out my mag light and flicked it on, aiming the powerful beam at the ground. The prints were at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. No shoe tread, no sign of a hoax. Just 5 clear toe impressions and a broad heel, like a bare human foot, but larger than any I had ever seen. And the stride between them had to be 6 feet or more. A twig snapped in the darkness at the edge of the clearing. I whipped the flashlight up, probing the ink-black spaces between the trees. The beam caught a pair of glowing green points, far off the ground, eyes staring back at me. Then they blinked and were gone. "Hello," I called out, my voice thin and shaky in the chill night air. "This is Ranger Tallgrass, National Park Service. Show yourself." Silence. Even the wind had died. I slowly reached back for the rifle slung over my shoulder. "I'm armed," I warned. "Don't try anything stupid." A huffing snort came out of the dark like a scoff. Then heavy footfalls, moving off through the brush. Not the 4-beat pace of a bear or cougar. A bipedal gait, like a man, but no man I had ever heard. Each step shook the ground. Then the sound faded into the night. I stood frozen for a long moment, straining to hear. But the forest was deathly still. Even the crickets had gone mute. It was like the whole woodland was holding its breath, afraid to make a sound. I backed slowly into the cabin, bolting the flimsy lock behind me. I made sure the rifle was loaded and kept it close at hand as I built a small fire in the wood stove. No way I was going to sleep. Not with that thing prowling out there in the dark. I pulled out the small satellite phone that was my only connection to the outside world. I had strict orders to use it only for check-ins and emergencies. Well, a giant hairy cryptid lurking around my cabin seemed to qualify. But who could I call? The rangers at HQ would think I'd gone crazy. The sheriff would laugh in my face. No, I was on my own out here. That was the whole point of this posting. A part of me relished the isolation even now, a chance to prove myself against the untamed wild. I made a pot of strong black coffee on the stove and settled into the rickety chair, the rifle across my knees. It was going to be a long night. Outside, the wind began to moan through the tallest branches, like a lonesome, inhuman howl. The next morning dawned cold and gray, mist hanging over the forest in spectral tendrils. I ventured cautiously outside, knuckles white on my rifle. The clearing was empty. The strange footprints were still there, stark in the muddy earth. I forced down some stale granola and instant coffee. Then I strapped on my pack, determined to carry out my duties. I had trails to check, backcountry campsites to inspect. Whatever was out there, I couldn't let it keep me from my job. But as I set off down the overgrown path into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, that creeping sensation on the back of the neck when unseen eyes are upon you. I scanned the dim green depths of the forest, glimpsed flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was never anything there. The days took on a strange, dreamlike quality as I hiked deeper into the wilderness. The gigantic tracks appeared sporadically along the muddy trails. I found tufts of shaggy hair snagged on branches far above my head, and always that oppressive sense of something ancient and wild observing me, just out of sight, biding its time. I started at every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves. My nerves were fraying, my mind playing tricks. Twice I spun and fired at shadows in the brush, only to find nothing. Sleep came in fitful snatches, plagued by eerie dreams of a dark shape looming over me. I began to dread the long hike back to my isolated cabin each night. The forest seemed to grow quieter, more ominous, as if it were waiting, hunting. On the third night, I sat hunched by the meager light of the fire, clutching my rifle, jumping at every gust of wind. Then I heard it, echoing through the trees, a long, ululating cry, halfway between a wolf's howl and a man's scream, but deeper, more powerful than either. It went on, raising every hair on my body to quivering attention. When it finally fell silent, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer alone in these woods, and I had the chilling sense that I was no longer the hunter, but the prey. The watcher was out there, and it was coming for me. I barely slept that night, jolting awake at every noise, finger tightening on the trigger of my rifle. The wailing cry did not come again, but I could feel the huge, unseen presence lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. With the pale dawn came a steely resolve. I would not be intimidated by this thing, this creature. Whatever it was, I was a warrior, a soldier, a guardian of this forest. It was my duty to face this threat head-on. After a quick breakfast of lukewarm coffee and beef jerky, I set out to patrol the backcountry trails as usual. But today I had a new mission. Today I hunted the hunter. I searched for signs of the creature's passage, broken branches, disturbed underbrush, the telltale footprints, but the forest seemed to conspire to conceal the signs. The hard-packed dirt and rotting foliage held no tracks. The grasping branches and dense thickets defied passage. It was as if the woods themselves were protecting their resident phantom. As I clambered up a steep, overgrown hillside, I abruptly stumbled into a small clearing, and there, starkly incongruous against the moldering forest floor, was a perfect ring of stones. In the center, a pile of offerings, a fish, a rabbit, wild berries, all carefully arranged, and in the middle, standing upright, a single large black feather. My skin prickled with gooseflesh. This was no casual, random assortment. It had a sense of purpose, of dark ritual. I had seen something similar a few times before, in my wanderings far out on the reservation. Places the shamans went to commune with the spirits, to invoke them, appease them. I crouched to examine the feather. It was larger than any bird I knew, at least 1.5 feet long. The quill was thick and sturdy, the iridescent black barbs tightly interlocked. It wasn't the feather of an eagle or owl or raven. In my gut, I knew it could only belong to one creature. Scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a huge, hairy form staring back at me. But the forest was silent, still, watching. Then my eye caught something else half hidden under the edge of the offering mound. A scrap of bright blue fabric, snagged on a jutting stone. With a trembling hand I tugged it free, my heart dropping into my boots. It was a child's t-shirt, torn and muddy, but the smiling yellow Star Wars droid was still recognizable. And on the inside collar, a name written in faded marker. Nate. I sat back heavily, nausea twisting my gut. I knew that name. The whole town knew that name. Little Nathan Parsons, the 6-year-old boy who had disappeared from his family's campsite 2 months ago without a trace. Scores of rangers, deputies, volunteers, and tracker dogs had scoured the woods for weeks. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed the child whole, until now. I looked again at the strange circle of stones, the offerings, the giant feather. What did it mean? I couldn't make myself consider the awful possibilities. An urgent instinct crystallized in my brain. I had to get back and report this, had to organize a new search, bring all of my ranger training to bear. If there was even a chance that Nate was still alive, I owed it to the family to. A scream split the air, so close and sudden that I nearly discharged my rifle in shock. A child's scream, long and piercing and terrified, coming from somewhere above me on the ridge. Then it cut off with horrible abruptness. I was running before I knew I had moved, slinging the rifle on my back, scrambling up the steep slope on all fours. Branches slapped my face, roots grabbed my ankles. All my vaunted caution was forgotten, replaced by pure adrenaline. I clawed my way to the top of the ridge and emerged into another small glade choked with head-high ferns. I peered frantically around, gasping for breath. The green fronds waved gently in the breeze, almost mocking in their serenity. "Nate!" I called, heedless of who or what might hear. "Nathan, can you hear me?" Nothing. No sound but my own ragged breathing and the agitated thump of my heart. Then, from the far side of the glade, a rustling. I whipped around just in time to see the ferns part. Something huge and dark was moving off through the brush, astonishingly fast and utterly silent for its size. In its arms it carried a small limp form clad in tan and blue. "No!" I screamed, unslinging my rifle and charging into the thicket. "Stop! Bring him back!" I burst through the last of the underbrush just in time to see the dark shape vanish over the next ridge. The child still clutched possessively to its chest. I got a single clear glimpse of a broad, hairy back, massively muscled shoulders. Then it was gone, leaving only violently swaying branches in its wake. I hurtled after it, jumping fallen logs, dodging mossy boulders. But despite my frantic pace, the distance between us grew. The creature moved through the primeval forest with fluid ease, as if the very trees moved their branches aside to ease its passage. I caught flashes of it through gaps in the foliage, a long, loping stride, a broad back furry and dark as a grizzly, the limp ragdoll form of the boy bouncing in its arms. Then they were gone, swallowed by the emerald gloom. After an eternity, I staggered to a halt in a carpet of decaying pine needles, lungs afire, a stitch stabbing my side. I bent double, hands braced on knees, my breath coming in hoarse rasps. There was no sign of the creature or the child. I looked around wildly. The ancient fir trees loomed in every direction, 1,000 square miles of trackless, unexplored forest. They could be anywhere. The thing could have an unlimited number of lairs, caves, hidden places, and it knew this wilderness far better than I ever would. A wave of desperate hopelessness crashed over me. I had failed little Nate, just as I had failed everyone else in my life. What if he was still alive when that thing took him? With shaking hands, I unclipped the radio from my belt and raised it to my lips to call for help. But my thumb froze on the button. Who would I call? What would I say? That Bigfoot had abducted a little boy? I could already hear the disbelief, the derision. At best, they would think the isolation had gotten to me, driven me crazy. At worst, I would be a suspect, fired, maybe even arrested. No, I was on my own. I had sworn an oath to protect this forest and everything in it, including that little boy. Wherever he was, I would find him. I would find the creature, and I would end this, one way or another. With grim resolve, I reloaded my rifle and struck off into the gloom of the titanic ancient trees. I had no idea what I was truly up against, but I knew I was heading into the deepest, darkest heart of the forest, and what I found there would change me forever, if I survived. I stumbled through the murky undergrowth for hours, calling Nate's name until my voice gave out, but only silence answered, broken by the mocking chitter of unseen birds, the skitter of small creatures in the loam. The forest seemed to close in around me, as if angered by my presence. As night fell, I was forced to make a crude camp in a hollow at the base of an enormous rotting stump. I built a small, smoky fire, knowing that it might draw the creature to me, almost hoping that it would. I was beyond fear, beyond doubt, focused only on the single-minded need to find Nate. I must have drifted into an uneasy doze propped against the stump. A huge hand clamped over my mouth and nose, jolted me awake, driving the breath from my lungs. I thrashed and grabbed for my rifle, but an iron arm pinned me like a child's doll. Rank, shaggy fur filled my nostrils. A guttural voice snarled words I couldn't comprehend. I craned my neck to look up into a face out of a nightmare. Flat, leathery features, a heavy brow ridge, small dark eyes glowing with feral intelligence, and teeth, far too many teeth, yellow and sharp in the firelight. It shook me like a disobedient puppy, growling more of its guttural speech. Even through my terror, I recognized the cadence, the phonemes. It was language, ancient and wild and utterly inhuman. The creature that had haunted 1,000 campfire legends was undeniably, terrifyingly real. Its huge body radiated brutal strength, animal musk, and a fierce, protective rage. I knew without doubt that it could snap my spine like a twig, but instead, it abruptly dropped me and vanished back into the night-black trees, leaving me gasping and shaking, my mind reeling. It could have killed me with less effort than a bear swatting a salmon from a stream, but it left me alive. Why? At dawn, I rose with renewed purpose. I would follow the creature back to its lair. Perhaps there, I would find Nate, or perhaps I would find the reason for all this, the strange offerings, the snatched child, my own bizarrely spared life. I set off in the direction the creature had disappeared, moving slowly, studying the ground. At first, I despaired of finding any trail. The forest floor was a carpet of decaying pine needles, twigs, leaves, swallowing all signs of passage. But then I noticed the subtlest of clues, a snapped sapling here, scuffed moss there, the barest print of a huge, splayed foot. I followed that tenuous trail deeper into the forest than I had ever dared before, into shadowed vales and fern-choked dells where the light never fully penetrated. The trees grew impossibly huge and ancient, bearded in hanging moss, mist-pooled in low places, pale and fetid. It was like slipping back in time, into a primordial world long lost. Late in the day, I caught a whiff of something on the breeze blowing up a narrow ravine. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. With a pounding heart, I crept forward, rifle at the ready. I emerged at the mouth of a hidden hollow between two granite cliffs, and there, tucked against the mossy stone, was a sight that stopped me cold. It was an enormous structure of branches and vines and mud, woven together with impossible intricacy. It towered 20 feet high, dwarfing the crude lean-to shelters I knew how to build. More than a hut, it was a primal cathedral, a lair, a den for a creature out of time. Tendrils of smoke rose from a vent in the roof, and from within came a sound that lifted the hairs on my neck. A voice. A child's quavering voice, chanting words I couldn't quite make out. And an answering rumble, a bass growl I now knew all too well. I threw caution aside and broke from the trees, sprinting for the entrance. I ripped aside the woven door of branches with a ragged shout. "Nate, I'm here to—" The words died in my throat. In the dim, smoky confines knelt the huge, shaggy form of the creature, and huddled before it, draped in a woven frond blanket, was a little boy. Nate. But he was not a prisoner. He was not crying or cringing in fear. He was nestled against the creature's furry bulk, his small hands clasped in its huge paws, and he was chanting with it, ancient words in a piping child's voice, eyes closed in something like reverence. They both fell silent and turned to stare at me. Nate's face, though smudged and scratched, was radiant with a strange, calm joy, and on the creature's, something I could only call satisfaction. "Welcome, Ranger," Nate said, in a voice far too old for his years. "We've been waiting for you." I stood frozen, trying to process the incomprehensible tableau before me. The creature I had come to think of as a monster, a predator, cradling the missing child I had sworn to rescue, and Nate looking up at me with that beatific, unsettling smile. "Nate," I croaked through a throat gone dry as the forest floor in summer. Are you all right? I'm here to bring you home." The boy glanced at the creature, as if seeking permission. It rumbled an assent, and Nate rose and padding over to me. He took my hand with small, strong fingers. "I am home, John Tallgrass. This is where I belong now. Where we all belong." I don't understand. That thing, it took you." "He, not it. He is Esker, and he is my teacher now." The words had the feel of ritual, of recitation. My addled mind latched onto the name with desperate relief. A label, an identity for the monster, something to grasp. Esker. The creature rose to his, full height, impossibly tall in the close confines of the woven den. He moved to loom behind Nate, not threateningly, but protectively. A huge, clawed hand came to rest on the boy's narrow shoulder. "Waxiyanista, of Duluntayetstil." The words were the same guttural language from the night before, and I still couldn't comprehend them. But I felt the weight of them, the import. What is he saying? Nate, please, you have to come back with me. Your parents." The boy squeezed my hand, and there was gentle pity in his eyes. "Esker says you are a seeker, that you walk between worlds, like us. That's why he brought me to you." I shook my head dumbly. "Brought you? Nate, I saw him take you. I've been tracking, trying to rescue you, and I'm grateful for that, John, really. But I didn't need rescuing. I came to Esker willingly. When he called to me that night, the memory of that awful echoing howl shivered up my spine. I looked desperately to the impassive, semi-human face above. "Called to you? I don't— Nate, this thing isn't human. It's some kind of animal. A throwback? No, you're wrong. Esker isn't human, but he's not an animal either. He's more, older, wiser. Nate's voice took on a strange, droning cadence, as if reciting from an oft-repeated lesson. The people of the forest, the Sasquatch, they were here before us, before any of the tribes. They remember what we've forgotten, how to live with the land, not just on it, how to speak to the spirits, to keep the balance. He turned to look up at the creature, and there was such naked worship in his small face that my heart twisted. Esker's dark, unfathomable eyes met the boy's, and a rumble of what could only be affection rattled the branches. Distantly, I realized I should be terrified, sickened. This was a child, in the thrall of a monster. Brainwashed, deluded, but some deep, primal part of me responded to the strange nobility in the creature's bearing, the uncanny wisdom in Nate's words, even as my rational mind railed against it. I don't understand any of this. You're just a child, Nate. You can't stay out here. It's not safe, not right. Nate smiled at me, and it was almost pitying. I'm not a child anymore, John. Esker's been teaching me, showing me the truth path. I'm his apprentice now, his living bridge to the world of men. The creature spoke again, slowly, as if wanting me to understand. Shuatu, Waxia. Shuatu of Portsoon. Nate nodded. Esker wants me to tell you. To explain so you can explain to others. He says it's time for the people of the forest to reach out again, to find the ones who still keep the old ways. Like you. Me? I barked a slightly manic laugh. Nate, I'm a park ranger. I grew up in suburb. What do I know of old ways? But you're of the first people, John. Your blood remembers even if your mind has forgotten. Why else do you think you ended up out here, alone in the wild? You were searching for something. Just like me. I sat down heavily on the woven floor, my head spinning. It was too much, too fast. Spirit monsters, ancient wisdom, chosen ones. I was a simple man, with a simple mission, serve and protect. But even as my world tilted on its axis, some deep, buried part of me responded to Nate's words, to the strange, primal presence of Esker. I thought of the stories my grandfather used to tell, before the drink took him, of animal spirits and vision quests, of skinwalkers and Wendigo, of the hidden world beyond the veil. Had I been searching, all this time, for meaning, for purpose, for something greater than myself? Was that why the forest called to me, welcomed me, even as it shunned others? I looked up at the boy, at the Sasquatch looming over him. Esker's eyes met mine, dark and alien and full of ancient knowledge, and I felt the world shift under me, like a great tree settling its roots. All right, I heard myself say, as if from a great distance. I'm listening. We talked long into the night, huddled around the smoky central fire of the den. Or rather, Nate talked, translating Esker's growls and rumbles, weaving a tapestry of history and myth that shook the foundations of everything I thought I knew. The Sasquatch, Nate explained, were an ancient people, perhaps the first to walk the forests of the Pacific Northwest. For uncounted generations they lived in secret harmony with the land, watching the rise and fall of lesser races, the coming of the First Nations, the arrival of the white man, the slow encroachment of what we called civilization. All the while, they guarded the deep knowledge, the primal wisdom that mankind had bartered away for shiny trinkets and empty comforts. How to speak the language of trees and rivers, how to walk between worlds, how to keep the fragile balance that let life flourish. They tried to pass on their teachings to a chosen few, shamans, medicine men, hermits, and mystics. But as time rolled on, fewer and fewer men were willing to listen, to learn. Now, with the world out of balance, the climate reeling, the web of life fraying, the Sasquatch knew a change was coming. A last chance to restore what had been lost, to heal the ancient bond between man and nature. And that chance hinged on a handful of humans like Nate, and perhaps like me. Wuxi, Esker rumbled, tapping a huge finger to my chest. Wuxi, Estiel. He's been watching you for a long time, John, Nate translated. Many of your seasons in the forests. He says you walk the path between, the way of the warden, between man and beast, forest and city, the tamed and the wild. You straddle the worlds, even if you don't know it. I shook my head slowly, trying to take it in. Me? Some kind of bridge between humanity and... what, exactly? Nature spirits? Interdimensional Bigfoots? But even as my rational mind scoffed, I felt the ring of truth in the words. Hadn't I always felt apart, adrift between worlds? Too native for the white man, too tamed for the res. A ghost in the city, but no true woodsman either. Not until I found the Park Service, and a purpose mediating between civilization and the wild. What does this mean? I asked, my voice hoarse and small in my own ears. What does he want from me? Nate glanced at Esker, then back to me, his young old eyes grave. To learn, like I am, the stories, the old ways, how to live between, and then to teach, to find others like us, and show them the path, to be a voice for the forest, for the Sasquatch, in the world of men, a Waxy at steel, a ranger who walks between. It was too much. Too huge, too terrifying in its implications. A week ago, my world had been so simple, just a man alone in the woods, doing an honest job. Now I didn't know what I was, what I could be. I stood abruptly, nearly cracking my head on the low woven roof. I need to think. I blundered out of the den, into the chill night. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and impossibly clear through the pines. I walked until I came to a small stream, and knelt to splash water on my face, gasping at the icy shock. What was I doing? What was I considering? To abandon my post, my old life, to go native and live like some wild man shaman, spouting mystic gibberish. It was insane, impossible, and yet some part of me, some deep, long-buried part, leapt at the chance, at the idea of a world with meaning beyond the flesh, of wisdom beyond the rote lessons of school and duty, at a chance to truly belong, to be part of something ancient and powerful, and terrifyingly, exhilaratingly real. I thought of Nate's shining, fervent face as he chanted the old words, of the strange sense of rightness I had felt in the den, in the presence of Esker's ancient, primordial power, of the way the trees seemed to lean in to listen when he spoke, the way the wind and the night birds seemed to carry his words, of the yearning that had always driven me here, to the deep forests, in search of something true. I sat back on my heels, letting the night soak into me, letting myself just be, for a moment, letting the warring voices in my head fall still. And in that silence I felt it, the pull, the whisper I had always sensed out here, but never quite understood, the voice of the wild, the song of the deep woods, the slow, deep pulse of a world far older and vaster and more full of wonders than I had ever dared to dream. It was waiting for me, had always been waiting. I just had to let myself hear it, heed it, to take that first step into a larger world. Slowly I rose and turned back towards the den, towards the flicker of firelight and the strange new path that awaited me. Overhead, just for a moment, I fancied I saw a flash of the great owl, the messenger of the spirit world, between the branches, or perhaps not. Perhaps it didn't matter what form the call came in, only that I finally answered. I stepped back into the woven den, to Esker's knowing eyes and Nate's bright, welcoming smile, to the first steps of the journey that would transform me, remake me, shatter me, and rebuild me, the journey of the ranger who walks between. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these ancient forests could throw at me. Bears, mountain lions, the occasional lost hiker who wandered too far from the marked trails. Standard fare for someone working the remote wilderness areas that stretch from the Utah Territory down through Four Corners country. My name doesn't matter much in this story, but what happened to me in those dark weeks between autumn and winter will haunt me for the rest of my days. It started with Bennett's radio call on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was stationed at the Ranger outpost near 9 Mile Valley, about 40 miles from the nearest town, when his voice crackled through the static-filled transmission. "Something's wrong with the wildlife patterns," Bennett reported from his patrol near Monument Valley. His voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. Bennett had been ranging these lands longer than anyone, a grizzled veteran who'd transferred here from assignments near Skinwalker Ranch and the Apache Reservation. If something spooked him, it was worth paying attention to. "Define wrong," I radioed back, setting down my morning coffee and reaching for my field notebook. "The elk are moving in circles, perfect circles. Found 3 separate herds doing it yesterday, and Silas confirmed the same behavior near Sedona. And the birds," Bennett paused, and I could hear wind whistling through his radio. "Haven't seen a single bird in 2 days, not one." I scribbled notes, my pen hesitating over the paper. Animal behavior anomalies weren't uncommon. Seasonal migration patterns, weather changes, even seismic activity could affect wildlife. But perfect circles? That was new. "Any signs of disease? Parasites?" I asked. "Negative. The animals look healthy. They just keep walking in those damn circles. Damien and Vincent are checking the northern sectors today. Harrison's team is expanding the survey toward Walker Lake." After signing off with Bennett, I spent the morning reviewing incident reports from neighboring districts. Nathaniel, the ranger covering the territory near Blind Frog Ranch, had filed 3 separate reports of unusual animal behavior in the past week. Kingston and Cole, working the eastern boundaries, reported finding deer that had died in geometric patterns, not from predation or disease, but as if they'd simply laid down to die in perfectly straight lines. The radio crackled again around noon. This time it was Zachary, calling from his station near the Navajo Nation border. "We've got a missing hiker," he announced, his young voice tight with concern. "George Tyler, 34, from Denver. His girlfriend, Elena, says he went out for a day hike 3 days ago and never came back. She filed a report with local authorities this morning. Missing hikers were serious business, but unfortunately not uncommon." I grabbed my emergency pack and radio coordinates while Zachary continued his report. "Elena's got some interesting details. Says Tyler was specifically interested in Native American folklore. Had books about skinwalkers, wendigos, that sort of thing. She tried to discourage him from hiking alone, but he insisted he was researching something important." A cold finger traced down my spine. I'd grown up hearing stories about skinwalkers from the Navajo Rangers I'd worked with over the years. Traditional beliefs spoke of malevolent witches who could transform into animals, creatures that walked the boundary between the human and animal worlds. Most of the older rangers, especially those with native heritage, refused to discuss the subject at all. "Did Elena mention which trail he was planning to take?" I asked. "That's the thing, she's not sure." Tyler was being secretive about his exact destination, but she found a map in his hotel room with several areas circled, all of them in the restricted zones near ancient burial grounds. I felt my jaw tighten. The restricted zones existed for good reason, not just to protect archaeological sites, but because the terrain was dangerous and poorly mapped. Every year, we lost at least 1 or 2 hikers who ignored the warning signs and wandered into areas where even experienced rangers moved with caution. "I'm heading out to coordinate search efforts," I told Zachary. "Contact Brandon, Austin, and Justin. Tell them to prepare for extended field operations. And Zachary, tell Elena we'll find him." But even as I said it, something cold settled in my stomach. The animal behavior anomalies, the missing hiker with his books about skinwalkers, the reports from rangers who'd worked near places like Skinwalker Ranch. It all felt connected in ways I couldn't yet articulate. As I loaded my gear into the ranger truck, I noticed something that made me pause. The forest around the outpost was completely silent. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, not even the buzz of insects. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like nature itself was holding its breath. I started the engine and headed toward the search coordinates, unaware that I was driving toward something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The truck's radio remained silent as I navigated the winding forest roads, but I could swear I felt eyes watching me from the shadows between the trees. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment everything changed. The moment the ordinary world I'd known for 15 years began to crack, revealing something far older and more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Something that had been waiting in these ancient forests long before the first European settlers arrived, long before the first ranger stations were built, long before men like me thought we could protect people from the darkness that dwells in the wild places. The search for George Tyler would become something much more. It would become my introduction to a nightmare I never could have imagined. The search for George Tyler began at dawn the next day. I assembled a team of 6 rangers. Gavin and Bentley would cover the eastern quadrants, while Amir and Brody took the western approach. Xavier and Tristan were assigned to the central area where Tyler's abandoned camp had been discovered by a local tribal police officer. Elena met us at the base camp, a slight woman in her early 30s with dark circles under her eyes and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She kept clutching a photograph of Tyler, a tall, athletic man with sandy hair and the kind of confident smile that suggested someone who'd never encountered real danger. He was obsessed, Elena told me as we reviewed the search grid. Ever since he read about that ranch in Utah, Skinwalker Ranch, he couldn't stop researching. He had theories about ancient migration patterns, about places where... She trailed off, shaking her head. I thought it was just academic curiosity. George has a PhD in anthropology. What kind of theories? I pressed gently. Elena pulled a worn notebook from her purse. He believed certain geographical locations served as what he called threshold points, places where the barrier between our world and something else was thin. He marked dozens of sites, Monument Valley, areas near the Apache Reservation, points throughout Four Corners country. I examined Tyler's notebook, and my blood chilled. The man had done extensive research, mapping not just folklore and tribal stories, but correlating them with unexplained disappearances, animal behavior anomalies, and what he termed reality distortions. His notes referenced conversations with tribal elders, scientific papers on magnetic field variations, and detailed topographical analyses of areas where unusual incidents had been reported. One entry dated just a week before his disappearance stood out. The pattern is clear. Every 28 years, activity peaks in this region. The last significant event was 1995. If my calculations are correct, something is building toward a climax in the next few weeks. Elena, I said carefully, when did George start this research? About 6 months ago, after we visited Sedona for a vacation. He interviewed some locals there, elderly Native Americans who told him stories about the old days. He came back changed, driven by something I couldn't understand. As we prepared to move out, Nicholas, our communications specialist, pulled me aside. Boss, we've got a problem. Radio communications are spotty at best in the search area, some kind of interference pattern I've never seen before, and the GPS units are giving inconsistent readings. Equipment malfunction? I wish it were that simple. The interference follows a pattern. It gets worse as you move toward the center of the search grid. Lewis and Barrett tested it yesterday during their preliminary survey. Barrett's GPS actually led him in a circle for 2 hours before he realized what was happening. I felt the familiar cold dread settling deeper in my gut. Professional instinct told me to call off the search, to wait for better equipment or additional personnel. But Tyler had been missing for 4 days already, and every hour decreased his chances of survival. We moved out in pairs, maintaining radio contact when possible and following standard search protocols. I partnered with Maxwell, a steady ranger with 10 years' experience who'd worked everywhere from the territory near Walker Lake to the remote areas around Blind Frog Ranch. The forest felt wrong from the moment we entered the search area. The trees grew in strange configurations, not the random patterns of natural growth, but almost geometric arrangements that made no biological sense. Massive pines stood in perfect lines, their branches interwoven in ways that blocked out most of the sunlight and created an unnatural twilight even in the middle of the day. You noticed the quiet? Maxwell asked after our first hour of searching. I had noticed. The forest was completely silent. No wind through the branches, no animal sounds, not even the creak of settling wood. Our footsteps seemed abnormally loud, echoing off the trees in ways that suggested the sound was traveling much farther than it should. Check your compass, I told Maxwell. He pulled out his orienteering compass and frowned. That can't be right. The needle was spinning slowly, never settling on any particular direction. Mine's doing the same thing. We pressed on, marking our path with bright orange tags and calling Tyler's name every few minutes. The responses echoed strangely, seeming to come back from different directions than they should, sometimes returning as distorted whispers that almost sounded like different words entirely. After 3 hours, we found Tyler's first camp, a professional setup with a high-end tent, portable stove, and enough supplies for a week-long expedition. Everything was perfectly arranged, as if he'd simply stepped away for a few minutes. His sleeping bag was still rolled out, his journal open to a page covered with frantic handwriting. I read the final entry with growing unease. It's here. The thing I've been tracking, the presence that exists at the threshold points. I can feel it watching me, circling closer each night. The animals know. They flee during the day and return at night to walk in patterns around my camp. Perfect circles, always moving clockwise. I need to document this, but I'm not sure I should. Some knowledge isn't meant to be preserved. Tomorrow I go deeper into the territory. If something happens to me, tell Elena I'm sorry. The old stories are true. All of them. Maxwell had been examining the camp perimeter and called me over to the edge of a small clearing. Look at this. Animal tracks surrounded the campsite. Elk, deer, bear, and smaller creatures. But they weren't random trail marks. The tracks formed concentric circles around Tyler's tent, dozens of perfect circles at different distances, as if various species had spent hours walking around and around the camp in an endless, purposeless parade. This is impossible, Maxwell said, his voice tight. Animals don't behave this way. Even if they were diseased or disoriented, they wouldn't maintain perfect formations. I knelt to examine the tracks more closely and noticed something that made my skin crawl. Mixed in with the animal tracks were human footprints, bare feet with unusually long toes and what appeared to be claw marks instead of regular toenails. The human tracks didn't form circles. Instead, they moved in a straight line from the forest edge directly to Tyler's tent, then back out again in a different direction. Maxwell, did you pack plaster for track casting? Yeah, but... He stopped, looking at the footprints I was studying. Jesus Christ, what the hell made those? Before I could answer, a sound echoed through the forest. A long, ululating howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human, but something caught between the two. Something that spoke of intelligence and malevolence, and an hunger that went beyond any natural predator. Maxwell's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, and I found myself doing the same. The sound faded, but the silence that followed felt even more oppressive than before. We need to call this in, Maxwell said. I pulled out my radio, but only static answered. The interference Nicholas had mentioned was getting stronger. I could barely make out fragments of transmissions from the other search teams, and what I could hear was troubling. Gavin's voice, distorted by static. Following us, Amir, barely audible. Tracks everywhere. Not right. Then, clear as if he were standing next to us, Tyler's voice came through the radio. "Don't follow me deeper. It's not what you think. It's not what any of us think." Maxwell grabbed the radio. "Tyler. George Tyler. Respond. What's your location?" Only silence answered. We stared at each other, both thinking the same impossible thought. Tyler had been missing for 4 days. His radio had been found in his abandoned camp. There was no way he could be transmitting on our frequency. But as we stood there in that unnatural forest clearing, surrounded by the circular tracks of animals that had no business walking in geometric patterns, I began to understand that we were dealing with something far beyond missing hikers or natural phenomena. Something was playing games with us. Something that could mimic human voices. Something that left tracks like a man but moved like a predator. Something that existed in the spaces between what we knew and what we feared. The real search was just beginning, and I had the terrible feeling that we weren't looking for George Tyler anymore. We were looking for whatever had taken him, and it was looking right back at us. By nightfall, we'd lost contact with 2 of our search teams. Gavin and Bentley had missed their scheduled radio check-in at 1800 hours, and Amir reported finding Brody's equipment scattered across a quarter-mile stretch of forest with no sign of Brody himself. I called for immediate extraction and regrouping, but the radio interference had grown so severe that I couldn't reach base camp. Xavier and Tristan confirmed my position through broken transmissions, but when I tried to coordinate our withdrawal, their voices dissolved into static punctuated by sounds that definitely weren't coming from human throats. Maxwell and I decided to establish a defensive position in Tyler's abandoned camp for the night. We had emergency rations, water purification tablets, and enough gear to survive until morning, when we could attempt to hike out of the interference zone and call for backup. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The oppressive silence of the day gave way to sounds that made both of us grip our weapons and peer nervously into the shadows beyond our small fire. Branches creaked and snapped despite the absence of any wind. Footsteps circled our position, sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes something that seemed to shift between the two mid-stride. "This is insane," Maxwell whispered, feeding another log into our fire. 20 years of park service, and I've never seen anything like this. I was studying Tyler's journal by firelight, hoping to find some clue that might explain what we were dealing with. The anthropologist's notes became increasingly frantic toward the end, filled with references to tribal stories about Yinandlushi, Navajo words that Tyler translated as those who walk on all fours. According to his research, these beings were witches who had gained the power to transform into animals by violating the most sacred taboos of their culture. They were said to be driven by an insatiable hunger for power and human suffering, able to mimic voices, steal faces, and move through the world as both predator and supernatural force. "Listen to this," I told Maxwell, reading from Tyler's notes. From an interview with Diego, a tribal elder near Monument Valley. "The skinwalker chooses its hunting ground carefully, places where the earth is thin, where the old powers still flow close to the surface. It will circle its territory for weeks, learning the scent and behavior of everything within its boundaries. When it finally hunts, nothing escapes." Maxwell stood up abruptly, staring into the darkness beyond our fire. "Did you hear that?" I listened carefully. At first there was only the usual forest silence. Then, faintly, I heard what had caught Maxwell's attention, voices calling our names from different directions. "Help me!" It was Gavin's voice, coming from the north. "I'm hurt. Can't make it back to camp." "Over here!" Bentley's voice, from the east. "Found something. You need to see this." "Jesus," Maxwell breathed. "They're alive." But something was wrong with the voices. They were too clear, too perfectly projected across the forest. And there was something else, an echo that didn't quite match the original sound, as if each voice was being played back a fraction of a second after it was spoken. "Maxwell, don't move." I grabbed his arm as he started toward Gavin's voice. "Listen again." This time I heard it clearly. Mixed in with Gavin's calls for help was another sound, a low chuckling, barely audible but unmistakably malicious. And Bentley's voice had developed a slight hiss, as if the speaker's tongue was too long for a human mouth. "It's mimicking them," I whispered. "Something out there is using their voices." The voices continued calling, growing more desperate and angry when we didn't respond. Then they began to change, becoming less human with each repetition. Gavin's pleas for help developed an animal growl underneath. Bentley's discoveries became threats, his voice dropping into registers no human throat could produce. Around midnight, the voices stopped entirely. The forest returned to its unnatural silence, but I could feel something moving just beyond the edge of our firelight. Shapes shifted between the trees, sometimes upright like a person, sometimes low to the ground like a large predator. There, Maxwell pointed to our left. Did you see that? I followed his gaze and caught a glimpse of something that made my rational mind rebel against what my eyes were telling me. It looked like a man at first glance, tall and lean, standing just at the edge of the light. But as I watched, its proportions seemed to shift. The arms were too long, the fingers extending into claws that gleamed in the firelight. Its head turned toward us with a motion that was too fluid, too flexible, as if the neck contained more vertebrae than any human spine. When it smiled, I saw rows of teeth that belonged in a predator's mouth. Don't look directly at it, I whispered to Maxwell, remembering something from Tyler's notes. The old stories say they grow stronger when they're observed, when they know they're feared, but it was too late for such precautions. The thing at the edge of our camp had noticed our attention, and its smile widened impossibly. When it spoke, it used Tyler's voice, not mimicked or distorted, but perfect in every detail. "You're in my hunting ground now," it said conversationally. "I've been watching you all day, learning your scents, your voices, your fears. The others are still alive, if you're wondering. I keep them alive as long as they remain entertaining." Maxwell raised his sidearm, but I pushed his hand down. "Bullets won't stop something like that," I hissed. The creature that wore a human shape laughed. Tyler's laugh, but with something hungry and cruel underneath it. The learned Dr. Tyler thought his knowledge would protect him. He knew all the old stories, understood the traditional protections, iron, fire, blessed objects. He tried them all. It held up something that glinted in the firelight. Tyler's silver cross, the one Elena had mentioned he always wore. None of it worked, the thing continued, its voice shifting between Tyler's academic tones and something far more primitive. "Because the old stories only tell part of the truth. We're not bound by your human rules, your human understanding of what's possible. We are the darkness between your certainties, the hunger that exists in the spaces where your logic fails." The creature began to circle our camp, staying just beyond the firelight, but close enough that we could see its outline shifting and flowing like smoke given form. "I smell your fear," it said, and now its voice was changing, cycling through different tones and accents. Gavin's voice, sweet and sharp. Bentley's voice, like copper pennies. Maxwell's own voice, like the sweat of prey animals. Maxwell was shaking now, his hand white-knuckled on his weapon. I understood his terror, but I also knew that giving in to panic would mean our deaths. Whatever this thing was, it fed on fear as much as flesh. I reached into my pack and pulled out Tyler's journal, flipping to a page I'd noticed earlier. "Listen to me," I told Maxwell quietly. Tyler wrote down some kind of protection ritual, Navajo words, specific actions. "I'm going to try it." "You don't speak Navajo," Maxwell whispered. "No, but..." Tyler phonetically wrote out the pronunciations, and Elena mentioned he'd been practicing traditional chants. The creature heard us talking and stopped its circling. "Oh, please do try the ritual." Dr. Tyler performed it beautifully, right before I wore his face to call out for help, but I was already beginning the chant Tyler had transcribed, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables but continuing with desperate determination. The words felt strange in my mouth, carrying weight and power that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere sound. As I spoke, something changed in the forest around us. The oppressive silence lifted slightly, and I could hear the faint sound of wind through the branches again. Our fire flared brighter, its light reaching farther into the darkness. The creature snarled, not with Tyler's voice but with something ancient and alien. For the first time since it had appeared, it seemed genuinely angry rather than merely amused. "Clever," it hissed, "but words alone won't save you. This is my territory, and you are trespassers in a realm where your kind has no power." The ritual Tyler had transcribed was incomplete, I realized. Whatever protection it offered was temporary at best, but it had given us something equally valuable, hope, and the knowledge that this creature wasn't invincible. As dawn approached, I began planning our escape. We needed to reach higher ground, get clear of the interference zone, and call for backup with equipment designed for dealing with something beyond ordinary search and rescue. But first, we needed to survive until morning, and the thing stalking us through these cursed woods seemed determined to ensure that dawn would bring no salvation. The real nightmare was just beginning. Dawn brought no relief. As pale light filtered through the canopy, the creature that had stalked us through the night simply melted back into the forest, leaving only the echo of Tyler's voice promising, "We'll continue this conversation soon." Maxwell and I broke camp quickly, both of us desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Tyler's original site. My radio crackled to life as we climbed toward higher ground. The interference was weakening, and I managed to establish brief contact with base. "Ola's here." Nicholas's voice cut through static. "Search team's missing. Need immediate backup. Nicholas, this is primary search leader, I transmitted. Do not send additional teams into the search area. Repeat, do not send backup. This is not a standard rescue operation. Understand? What's your status? Before I could respond, Tyler's voice came through the radio again, clear as if he were standing next to the transmission equipment. Everything's fine here, Nicholas. False alarm. All teams accounted for. We'll be returning to base by noon. Maxwell grabbed the radio from my hands. Nicholas, disregard that transmission. We have a hostile situation, but the radio had gone dead again. The creature was learning, adapting its tactics. It understood our technology well enough to manipulate it, and it had apparently been listening to our communications long enough to know our protocols and personnel. It's hurting us, I told Maxwell as we climbed a ridge that offered a view of the surrounding forest, keeping us isolated while it picks off the search teams one by one. Why? Maxwell asked. If it wanted us dead, it could have killed us last night. I consulted Tyler's journal as we walked. The answer was there, in the anthropologist's increasingly frantic handwriting. The skinwalker doesn't simply kill, it consumes identity itself. Each victim becomes part of its arsenal, another voice it can use, another face it can wear. The longer it keeps prey alive and terrified, the more completely it can absorb their essence. From the ridge we could see disturbing evidence of the creature's activities throughout the forest below. Animals continued to move in those impossible geometric patterns, deer, elk, and bear walking endless circles through the trees like biological clockwork. But now we could see human figures mixed among them. Jesus Christ, Maxwell breathed, pointing to a clearing about half a mile away. Is that Gavin? Through my binoculars I could make out a human figure walking in the same mindless circular pattern as the animals. It moved with Gavin's characteristic stride, wore his ranger uniform, but something was fundamentally wrong with its posture and movements. And there, I said, scanning the area. Bentley, Xavier, Tristan, all of our missing team members were visible in different clearings, each walking their own endless circle, each moving with the mechanical precision of wind-up toys. They were alive but not alive, present but somehow absent. As we watched, one of the figures, I thought it might be a mirror, suddenly stopped its circular walk and looked directly up at our position on the ridge. Even at this distance, I could see it smile and wave at us with cheerful normalcy before resuming its endless patrol. We need to get word out, I said. Whatever's happening here is beyond anything Park Service protocols are designed to handle. This needs military intervention or... I trailed off, realizing how insane that sounded. Or what? Ghostbusters? Maxwell's attempt at humor fell flat in the morning air. Who's going to believe this? Hell, I'm living it and I don't believe it. Before I could answer, we heard voices calling from the forest below. Elena's voice, clear and desperate. Please help me. I came looking for George and got lost. I'm injured. That's impossible, Maxwell said. Elena's back at base camp, but the voice continued, growing more desperate. I can see you on the ridge. Please come down. My ankle's broken. Then, horribly, George Tyler's voice joined the calls. She's telling the truth. I found her this morning, but there's something hunting us. Something that's been wearing my face. Maxwell started down the slope toward the voices before I could stop him. Maxwell, wait, what if it's really them? He called back. What if Tyler managed to rescue Elena somehow? I knew it wasn't them. Tyler's journal had made it clear that he understood exactly what was stalking him, and a man with his knowledge would never expose Elena to this danger. But Maxwell's rational mind was grasping for rational explanations, unable to fully accept what we'd witnessed. The voices grew more frantic as I chased Maxwell down the ridge. Elena's pleas became sobs of pain and fear, while Tyler's voice took on notes of genuine panic. It's coming back, the thing that's been hunting me. Please hurry. When we reached the tree line, the voices stopped abruptly. Maxwell froze, finally realizing the trap, but it was too late. We were back in the creature's territory, back within its sphere of influence. Welcome home, Tyler's voice said from directly behind us. We spun around to find Dr. George Tyler standing 20 feet away, looking exactly as he had in Elena's photograph. Healthy, unharmed, wearing clean hiking clothes and a confident smile. If not for the context, I would have believed this was the real man we'd been searching for. George! Maxwell took a step forward. Thank God you're all right. Where's Elena? Maxwell, don't, I warned. But Tyler was already speaking, his voice perfectly matching my memory of our brief radio contact with the missing hiker's girlfriend. She's safe. I found a cave system about 2 miles north of here. She's resting while her ankle heals. Tyler's smile never wavered. I've been trying to reach you on the radio, but there's some kind of interference in this area. Every word was reasonable, every detail plausible. If I hadn't read Tyler's journal, if I hadn't seen the creature stalking our camp the previous night, I might have been convinced, but Tyler's eyes were wrong. They held intelligence and cunning, but not human intelligence. When he looked at us, it was with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Show us," I said. "Take us to Elena." "Of course." Tyler turned and began walking deeper into the forest. "It's not far, but I should warn you, there are some dangerous animals in this area. I've seen tracks from something large, possibly a bear or mountain lion. We should stay close together." As we followed him through the trees, Tyler kept up a steady stream of conversation that was pitch perfect for a rescued hiker. Gratitude for the search effort, explanations of how he'd survived, concern for Elena's injury. But underneath his words, I could hear something else, a barely suppressed amusement, as if the creature was enjoying this performance immensely. "How did you find Elena?" Maxwell asked. Our reports indicated she was still at base camp. Tyler's stride hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Oh, she came looking for me when I didn't return. Got lost in these woods. Lucky I found her when I did." She was starting to panic. It was a plausible lie, but it revealed something important. The creature didn't have perfect knowledge of our operations. It was improvising, adapting its deceptions based on what we said and did. "Tyler," I said carefully, "what did you discover out here? Elena mentioned you were researching folklore about skinwalkers." This time the hesitation was more noticeable. The creature wearing Tyler's face turned back toward us, and for just a moment, its expression was completely alien, ancient, predatory, and utterly inhuman. "Just academic curiosity," Tyler said, his voice carrying a slight echo that hadn't been there before. "Local legends, traditional stories, nothing that turned out to be factual." But even as it spoke, the thing that pretended to be Tyler was changing. Its movements became more fluid, its proportions subtly incorrect. The clothes it wore began to look less like real fabric and more like a projection, a shape imposed on something that didn't naturally hold human form. "Where exactly is this cave?" I pressed. "Just ahead," Tyler replied, but its voice was starting to slip, becoming deeper, developing harmonics that no human throat could produce. "You'll see it soon. Elena's waiting." Maxwell had finally noticed something wrong. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, and Tyler noticed the movement immediately. "Is there a problem?" it asked. And now its smile showed too many teeth. I realized we were about to witness the creature's true nature, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for what that might mean. The false Tyler was done playing games. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. What happened next shattered every assumption I'd held about the natural world and my place within it. Tyler's false face began to melt like wax in summer heat, revealing something underneath that my mind struggled to process. The features flowed and shifted, cycling through every member of our search team. Gavin's weathered face, Bentley's young features, Amir's dark eyes, Brody's distinctive beard. But it didn't stop there. As we watched in horror, the creature showed us faces I didn't recognize, men and women of various ages and ethnicities, each expression frozen in a moment of final terror. How many people had this thing consumed over the years? How many identities had it stolen and worn like masks? "You want to see what I really am?" it asked, its voice cycling through dozens of different tones, some human, some decidedly not. "Very few have seen my true face and lived to remember it." Maxwell managed to draw his weapon, but his hand was shaking so badly he could barely aim. "Stay back, federal agent." The creature laughed with a sound like breaking glass. "Federal agent? In my territory? You're nothing here, little man. You're meat that learned to walk upright and forgot its place in the food chain." The final transformation was the most disturbing yet. Tyler's borrowed flesh fell away entirely, revealing something that existed at the intersection of human and animal, possessing the worst attributes of both. It stood upright like a man but moved with predatory grace that belonged to no earthly creature. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in directions that defied anatomy. Most horrible of all were its eyes, human intelligence burning with an alien hunger that spoke of eons spent perfecting the art of causing fear. "This is what your ancestors knew," it said, beginning to circle us with movements that were hypnotically fluid. "This is what they warned you about in stories you dismissed as primitive superstition. We are the darkness that hunts at the edges of your firelight. The whisper that makes you check the locks twice before sleeping." It paused directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell its breath. Carrion and copper and something else, something that reminded me of ozone after lightning strikes. "Do you know what I've learned in my centuries of hunting your kind?" it asked conversationally. "Humans are remarkably predictable. You create rules and structures to make sense of a universe that operates by no rules you can comprehend. You convince yourselves that knowledge equals power, that understanding equals control." Maxwell's weapon finally steadied enough to aim, but the creature ignored him completely. Dr. Tyler believed his research would protect him. He knew the traditional warnings, understood the historical context, even attempted the old rituals, but he made the same mistake all your kind make. He thought he was the hunter instead of the prey. "What did you do with our people?" I demanded. "The search team members, are they alive?" "Oh, they're very much alive. They're experiencing something far beyond death. They're learning what it means to exist without the comforting illusions of human consciousness. They walk my patterns now, adding their steps to the great design I've been weaving across this landscape for decades." It gestured toward the forest around us, and I began to understand the true scope of what we were facing. The animal tracks we'd found, the geometric patterns, the circular migrations, they weren't random behavioral anomalies. They were parts of something larger, a vast ritual or summoning that used living creatures as components. "Every 28 years, the barriers weaken," the creature continued. "Places like this become permeable. What your friend Tyler didn't understand is that I'm not just hunting for food or sport. I'm preparing for something much grander." "Preparing for what?" "The return." Its inhuman features arranged themselves into something resembling a smile. "My kind once walked openly in this world, before your ancestors learned to make fire and forge iron. We were pushed back, confined to the spaces between your certainties, but we never truly left. And every few decades, we remember what this world was like when we ruled it." The implications of what it was telling me were staggering. If this creature was telling the truth, then we weren't dealing with an isolated incident. We were witnessing preparation for something that could affect far more than just our small corner of the wilderness. "The missing hikers over the years," I said, pieces falling into place. "The unexplained disappearances near places like Skinwalker Ranch, the Apache Reservation, Blind Frog Ranch. You've been building toward this for decades." "Centuries," it corrected. "Each cycle requires more preparation as your kind grows more numerous and more sophisticated. But you also grow more disconnected from the natural world, more dependent on technologies that fail in places where the old powers flow strong." As if to demonstrate its point, both our radios began emitting a high-pitched whine that rose and fell like a siren. Our GPS units flickered and died, their screens showing impossible coordinates that placed us simultaneously in Monument Valley, Sedona, Walker Lake, and 9 Mile Valley. "Your rescue is not coming," the creature said. "Your technology cannot reach you here. You exist now in my space, by my rules, and those rules are very simple. Predator and prey, hunter and hunted." Maxwell finally worked up the courage to fire his weapon. The bullet struck the creature's center mass and passed through, as if it were shooting smoke. The thing didn't even pause in its conversation. "Iron," it noted clinically. "Very traditional. Your bullets are steel, actually, but close enough to the old protections that they might work under different circumstances. Unfortunately, you're not in Kansas anymore." That's when I noticed something that gave me a desperate idea. The creature's casual dismissal of traditional protections hadn't been entirely accurate. When Maxwell's bullet passed through its form, the impact point had flickered, not quite solid for a fraction of a second. "Tyler's ritual," I said suddenly, the protection chant from his journal. "It worked, didn't it? That's why you pulled back last night." The creature's eyes narrowed. "Temporarily inconvenienced me, nothing more." But there had been something else in Tyler's notes, something I'd missed in my earlier reading. I pulled out the journal, flipping pages while the creature watched with obvious amusement. "Looking for magic words to save you?" it asked. "Please continue. I do so enjoy watching prey cling to false hope." I found the page I was looking for, not a protection ritual, but something Tyler had labeled as a banishment ceremony. According to his notes, this wasn't traditional Navajo practice, but something he'd reconstructed from multiple tribal sources, combined with elements from other indigenous traditions across the Americas. "The theory," Tyler had written, "is that skinwalkers exist partially outside normal space-time, anchored to our reality by their connection to specific geographic locations. If that connection could be severed during a period of dimensional weakness, the ritual required 3 elements. Words of banishment spoken with absolute conviction, a physical token from the creature's territory that could be destroyed, and most importantly, the willing sacrifice of something the speaker valued more than their own life." I looked at Maxwell, this good man who'd followed me into nightmare without question, and made the hardest decision of my career. "Maxwell, when I start the chant, I need you to run. Get back to that ridge, get clear of the interference zone, and radio for help. Tell them to evacuate everyone within 50 miles of this area. I'm not leaving you here with that thing. You have to. This isn't about bravery. It's about stopping something that could affect thousands of people if it completes whatever it's planning." The creature had been watching this exchange with predatory interest. How touching. "But you've both misunderstood the situation. Neither of you is leaving this forest. You're going to join my collection, and in 28 years, when the barriers weaken again, you'll help me prepare for the next phase." I began Tyler's reconstructed chant, stumbling over pronunciation but pushing forward with desperate determination. The creature's amusement faded as the alien syllables echoed through the forest. "Stop," it commanded, its voice carrying harmonics that made my bones ache. But something was happening. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on the forest began to lift. Bird calls returned to the distance. The geometric patterns of animal movement visible through the trees began to break up as creatures fled in natural, chaotic directions. "You don't know what you're doing," the creature snarled, its form beginning to flicker like a bad television signal. I reached the final phase of the ritual and pulled out my ranger badge. 20 years of service, the symbol of everything I'd dedicated my life to protecting. The physical token from its territory would be the forest itself, represented by a handful of soil I grabbed from the ground. "For everyone who came before, everyone who comes after, and everyone who walks these woods in peace," I shouted, throwing the soil into the creature's fluctuating form while crushing my badge in my other hand. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The creature's scream shattered trees 50 yards away. Its form began to collapse inward, pulling at reality itself like a black hole made of malevolent intention. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," it shrieked as it imploded. "The barriers are already thin. The cycle cannot be stopped. My kindred will sense what you've done and come to finish what I started." Then it was gone, leaving behind only the echo of its final warning and the sound of the forest slowly returning to life. Maxwell and I stood in stunned silence, both of us unable to fully process what had just happened. In the distance, I could see human figures stumbling through the trees, our missing search team members, finally free from whatever compulsion had held them. But as we began the long trek back to civilization, the creature's final words haunted me. "The cycle cannot be stopped. My kindred will sense what you've done." I'd won this battle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the war was far from over. And somewhere in the vast wilderness that stretched from the Utah Territory down through Four Corners country, other things like the creature we'd just banished were stirring, sensing that their ancient schedule had been disrupted. 28 years was a long time, but it might not be long enough to prepare for what was coming next. I retired from Park Service 3 months after the incident. The official report attributed the search team disappearances to environmental disorientation caused by unusual magnetic field fluctuations, and Tyler's body was never found. Elena returned to her life in Denver, never knowing how close she'd come to becoming part of something far worse than simple tragedy. But I kept Tyler's journal, and I've spent the years since that day researching other incidents, other places where reality seems thin and dangerous things slip through the cracks. The creature was right about one thing. This happens in cycles, and humanity's growing disconnection from the natural world has made us more vulnerable, not less. If you're reading this account, it's because the 28-year cycle is approaching its end, and the signs are building toward something I pray I won't live to see. Watch for the patterns: animals moving in geometric formations, electronics failing in specific geographic areas, voices calling from empty wilderness that sound like people you know and trust. And if you find yourself in a place where the old stories feel more real than rational explanation, remember this: some knowledge comes at a price higher than ignorance, but sometimes paying that price is the only thing standing between civilization and the hunger that waits in the spaces between our certainties. The skinwalkers are real. They are patient, and they are coming home. My name is Ahanu, which means he laughs in Cherokee. But there was nothing to laugh about on that fateful night deep in the remote wilderness of the Pine Ridge National Forest. I became a park ranger for the tranquility and to escape the noise of the city and my mounting debts. I loved nature and figured spending my days amongst the towering pines and serene lakes was better than fighting traffic and cubicle life, even if the pay was meager. Little did I know the horrors lurking in the shadows of this pristine landscape. It started with campers reporting strange sightings at the fringes of their campfire light. A hulking creature that seemed half man, half beast, glowing eyes peering from the darkness, an eerie howl cutting through the night. Most dismissed them as bears or overactive imaginations fueled by too many campfire ghost stories. But the reports kept coming, and the details grew more disturbing. Then the disappearances started. Campers would set off on an afternoon hike and never return. Search parties found only shredded clothing and the lingering stench of wet fur and decay. By the time the third hiker went missing, I knew we were dealing with something beyond the natural order. Something sinister. I had heard the tribal elders speak of dark legends in these woods, tales of shapeshifters and skinwalkers, unholy creatures who could take the form of animals, ancient spirits full of malice and hunger. The dogman. Could those old myths hold a kernel of truth? Were those campfire stories not stories at all, but warnings? I voiced my suspicions to the park superintendent, who scoffed and told me to stop listening to superstitious nonsense. To him it was just a bear, maybe a cougar, The hiking trails remained open. More families arrived, pitching tents amongst the towering pines, completely oblivious to what might be watching from the shadows. But I could feel it in my bones, a creeping dread that coiled around my spine. We were all in terrible danger, so I took it upon myself to hunt the hunter. I armed myself with my grandfather's rifle and an old tribal map marking places of power, sites where the membrane between worlds was thin, places of ancient darkness. Night after night I searched, following the reports and my instincts deeper into the forest, away from the trails, watching, waiting. Then one moonless night I found it. Or perhaps it found me. The creature erupted from the undergrowth in a blur of dark fur and slashing claws. I barely had time to register the imposing silhouette, towering, powerfully muscled, a twisted amalgamation of man and wolf. Before it was upon me, I managed to get off a shot, more out of reflex than skill. The bullet grazed the beast's shoulder and it reeled back with a pained yelp that sent chills skittering down my spine. Not quite human, not quite animal. The acrid scent of its blood and musk filled my nostrils. It fixed me with a baleful glare, yellow eyes flickering with ancient intelligence and malevolence. Then it lunged again, jaws gaping, strings of saliva stretching between dagger-like teeth. Time dilated. I felt its hot breath, saw my reflection in those rabid eyes. At the last second I dove aside and the creature's momentum carried it past me, its claws shredding the air where I had stood a heartbeat before. Scrabbling for purchase, I brought the rifle around, pulled the trigger, and was met with an impotent click. In my panic, I hadn't reloaded. The creature's lips peeled back in a predatory grin, as if mocking my mortal failure. It crept forward, in no hurry now, savoring the moment before the kill. I scrabbled backwards in the dirt until my back hit the gnarled trunk of an ancient pine. Nowhere left to run. As it stalked closer, a strange sort of calm settled over me. Perhaps it was ancestral memory stirring to life, or perhaps just grim acceptance. My hand brushed against something cool and metallic nestled between the roots, an old railroad spike, rusted but still sharp. Improvising, I snatched it up and brandished it before me like a totem. Like a part of me knew what to do. The dogman snarled, unimpressed by my paltry defense. It tensed, muscles rippling beneath its matted fur, ready to pounce and tear out my throat. But as it sprung, I thrust the railroad spike forward with all my strength, speaking words that came unbidden to my tongue. An ancient prayer or curse, I still don't know which. The iron spike plunged into the creature's chest as its full weight slammed into me, driving the air from my lungs. Its jaws clamped inches from my face, clashing together like a steel trap. Thick, dark blood bubbled up around the wound, hissing like acid where it touched the old metal. The creature convulsed and thrashed, but I held on, using its own weight to drive the spike deeper. Finally, with a shuddering whine, the unnatural light died from its eyes, and it collapsed heavily on top of me, the stench of its death cloying and thick. I had won. But as I lay there gulping lungfuls of coppery air, the true horror of my situation sank in. This was only the beginning. The dogman I had slain was not alone. Far in the distance, yet entirely too close, a chorus of eerie howls rose to the moonless sky. Howls that echoed with bitter rage and bloodthirst, and something almost akin to dark joy. A shudder racked my frame as realization settled in my gut like a ball of ice. They knew I was here now, and they were coming for me. Oblivion crept in at the edges of my vision, beckoning, but I clawed my way stubbornly back to consciousness, no doubt driven by the primal, stubborn thing inside all living creatures that fears the void. Or maybe it was the sheer enormity of what I had discovered, a truth I had to survive to share. With trembling hands that didn't quite feel like my own, I heaved the creature's still warm bulk off me. It was heavier than any natural wolf or even bear would have been, and up close the grotesqueness of its half-human features churned my stomach. I felt unclean where its blood had soaked into my clothes, my skin, as if its unholiness was an oily taint. The night tasted different now, charged with a kind of electric menace that raised the hairs along my arms and prickled at the base of my skull. I imagined I could feel the thud of paws against loam, the pant of predatory breath. The howls had gone silent, but that was almost worse, a reminder of the malevolent intelligence behind this hunt. I couldn't linger here, not with my bullet count halved and exhaustion and pain clamoring at the edges of my awareness. I needed to regroup, to think, however impossible that seemed, now that the safe, sane world had been ripped away to reveal the hungry darkness pacing at the edges of the firelight. Overhead, the trees whispered to each other in a language of creaks and sighs, branches weaving together to blot out the stars until only isolated shards peeked through, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to the tiny, fleshy things stumbling wounded between the trunks. Thirst buzzed in my throat, and I fantasized about the cool, clear waters of the river to the south, though I knew that's where I would be most vulnerable, crouched low and unsuspecting. Everywhere, innocuous shadows twisted into threatening shapes as my weary mind was increasingly unable to distinguish nightmare from reality. After what might have been minutes or hours of this torturous paranoid flight, the trees gave way to a small clearing dominated by a massive, lightning-scarred pine. Gritting my teeth, I hauled myself into its branches, feeling like a child again, seeking refuge from imagined monsters. Only these monsters were all too real. The bark bit into my skin as I nestled into the craggy fork and settled in to wait for daylight. Wind rattled through the boughs like hoarse, mocking laughter. With only my racing thoughts for company, I questioned for the umpteenth time what I was doing out here. If one man alone could hope to stand against the shambling terrors of these deep woods, but I had chosen this lonely path to become the watcher in the night, guarding oblivious campers, even if they would never know the threats I faced in their stead. Even if my disappearance would be met only with shrugs and sighs of, "He knew the risks." Because someone had to take back the night from the beasts lurking in its shadows. Exhaustion finally overtook me and I slipped into a fitful doze full of fever dreams of snapping jaws and chilling howls, wishing I could wake up in my old life of cramped commutes and bill collectors, blissful in my ignorance. Too soon a rising clamor roused me from my uneasy slumber, distant but growing louder and nearer with every hammering heartbeat, a cacophony of snaps and low snarls and uncannily human-like murmurs. Dread pooled cold and viscous in my belly as I peered between the branches. The dogmen had found me. They spilled into the clearing like a surging tide of fur and fang. Even from my hidden vantage, the stink of carrion and musk lay heavy on the back of my tongue, cloying and invasive. But it was not their stench nor even their ravening jaws that chilled me most. It was the glint of cunning in their eyes and the grotesque parody of tactics they employed as they ringed the tree with a perimeter of hulking bodies. These were not mere beasts driven by instinct. Observing them now, I could not help but see the keen, wicked intelligence in their movements, a predatory society within the shadows of our own. One of the creatures, even more massive and grizzled than the others, lifted its shaggy head and scented the air. Its eyes, a jaundiced yellow that glimmered with ancient malice, met mine through the screen of pine needles. Lips stretched back from a muzzle matted with old blood to reveal jagged teeth and a hideous approximation of a grin. It knew I was here. The alpha threw back its head and released a short, ululating howl that scraped along my nerves like rusted metal. The others milled restlessly but did not advance, awaiting some unspoken signal. My heart hammered against my ribs, as if it might break through and flee this nightmare of its own accord. I thought of the rifle dangling uselessly at my side and almost laughed at the dark irony. Even if I had 1,000 bullets, it would only delay the inevitable now that I was well and truly up a tree. Perhaps this had been their plan all along, to herd me like prey to this place, where the illusion of escape hung tantalizingly close but always out of reach. Slow, cold dread seeped into my veins at the prospect of so ignoble and agonizing an end. Would I even have the courage for a swan dive to a clean death when the time came? But they didn't advance. They only watched, waiting, grinning. The wind gusted then, carrying with it a scent that cut through the miasma of dog stink. Smoke, wood smoke, unmistakable and unutterably welcome because it meant people. A campfire, close. In my exhaustion and fear, I had lost track of how near I'd come to the designated camping grounds. From the sudden keen look on the alpha's face, it had caught the scent too, and come to the same realization as it stepped forward with clear intent. Ice crystallized in my gut as visions of the campers' impending slaughter flashed across my mind's eye. I thought of the families, innocent and oblivious and laughing in the glow of their fire, perhaps roasting marshmallows and trading scary stories that couldn't approach the horror now loping towards them on silent, hungry feet. Of the children, gap-toothed and bright-eyed and so heartbreakingly unafraid of the dark. Even as the nightmare visions swam before me, a strange calm settled over my galloping thoughts. At last I understood, with the clarity of one who has nothing left to lose, what I had to do. My purpose, if there could be any purpose to this unraveling of reality, lay along the shadowed path the dogmen now trod. There was no other way. I had to go through them. With numb fingers I pried open my grandfather's old hunting knife. The blade gleamed in the fading light, etched with the same symbols I had seen at the sites of power, their meaning tantalizingly close but ultimately elusive. No matter. I would have to hope the old magic in the runes and in my blood would be enough. I pressed my thumb to the keen edge until crimson beaded and smeared on the shining steel. The coppery scent mingled with pine sap and loam, and, beneath that, the blood reek of the beasts below. Holding the knife before me like a talisman, I began to climb down, intoning the ancient words that had saved me before. The dogmen watched. The alpha's grin widened. My boots hit the ground. I was committed now. On my terms, not theirs. As if to mock my resignation, the wind changed, bringing again the scent of smoke. The creature's nostrils flared and they glanced among themselves, a ripple of impatience traveling through the pack as the call of easier prey sang to them. The alpha turned back to me, lips wrinkling to bare fangs in a snarl of dark amusement, as if to say, "We have time enough for meat sport with you, little prey, once we've glutted on the softer morsels." With that, it made a coughing bark that set the pack to flowing around me like a hellish tide, their passage ruffling my hair and clothes with the stench of the grave. I had the giddy sense I was being gifted a head start, a challenge. Catch us if you can, meet, or bear witness to what will be left in our wake. Then they were gone, melting into the gloom between the trees with preternatural speed and silence, and leaving me alone with only the rasp of my breath and rabbit thud of my heart. After a frozen, thunderstruck moment that could have been a minute or an eternity, I tore off after them, crashing through the woods with all the grace and subtlety of a wounded bear. Their grotesque silhouettes flickered through the trunks, always just ahead and moving with malicious leisure to allow me to catch up before pulling ahead again, taunting. At any moment I expected to feel the white-hot slash of claws parting my spine or teeth closing on my throat, but on I stumbled, numb to the briars that carved bloody furrows in my skin and the branches that slapped and tore at my face. Sparkles swarmed my vision and my lungs knifed with each heaving breath, but still I pushed myself to the dregs of my endurance, because I knew what would happen when they reached the campground, when they fell on the unsuspecting innocents peacefully slumbering, trusting in the rules of the world they thought they knew, the rules I had thought I'd known, before this long night shattered them beyond repair. Ahead, the dancing firelight spilled between the reaching shadows of the trees. Distant laughter drifted on the breeze, upraised voices blissfully ignorant of the red-toothed death loping towards them. Despair crushed the air from my lungs as I realized I was too late, too slow and stupid and human to stop the coming carnage. They were so close now. So close. A rising scream built in my burning lungs, but I choked it back, not wanting to begin the slaughter prematurely, knowing with utter certainty that I was about to bear witness to horrors no mind could survive intact, but powerless to tear my eyes away. At the edge of the clearing, the dogmen slowed, gathering in a ring just beyond where the firelight lapped at the hungry darkness. Their eyes flashed like hellish coals and their jaws slavered with the nearness of their prey. They had played out the hunt to their satisfaction. Now, the killing time had come, and I could only watch and pray death would take me swiftly after. The creature's muscles bunched and coiled, poised on the precipice between restraint and relieved savagery. Firelight shimmered along the edges of wicked claws and glazed across eyes alight with terrible hunger. In the moment that followed, time seemed to slow to a crawl, seconds stretching into an eternity. The night held its breath. My pulse roared in my ears like a distant freight train, nearly drowning out the crackle and pop of the fire. Then the alpha moved mind, a rippling of shadowed muscle, more sensed than seen, and the pack exploded into motion. They overran the campsite like a dark tide of fangs and fur. Screams rang out, cut brutally short or gurgling away into liquid, rattling desperation. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy on the air, mingling obscenely with the lingering aroma of roasted marshmallows. Through the strobing, nightmarish light of the fire, I caught glimpses of the slaughter, a child's pale arm disappearing into a forest of legs, a teen wrenched, spread eagle between two hulking shapes, someone's grandmother tossed like a rag doll atop the picnic table. The snarls and growls of the dogmen twined with the pitiful whimpers and pleading of their victims until the two became indistinguishable. And through it all, I could only watch, frozen, my mind refusing to process the sheer horror unfolding before me. Some distant part of me railed against my inaction, demanded I intervene, but a wiser, more craven part knew, with gut-wrenching certainty, that to reveal myself now would only join my screams to the blood-soaked chorus. So I bore witness, as much as any mortal mind could, and felt the slow, inexorable shattering of my sanity with every arterial spray and anguished wail. I watched as they shredded skin from bone and cracked limbs like kindling, as they played tug-of-war with loops of glistening intestine and gnawed on limbs like macabre chew toys. And when it was over, when the last twitches had stilled and the campsite was reduced to a charnel house of gore and viscera, they turned as one to stare into the darkness where I stood, trembling and tear-streaked. The alpha's muzzle dripped scarlet as it grinned that terrible grin, tongue lolling obscenely. They knew I was there. Worse, they knew I had seen and done nothing. The weight of that knowledge, that complicity, settled like a millstone in my chest, crushing the air from my lungs until spots swarmed my vision. Then, with a nonchalant shake of its shaggy head, the alpha turned and loped back into the tree line, its pack following suit until only the mutilated remains and the buzzing of flies broke the sepulchral silence of the blood-soaked clearing, leaving me alone with the horror of what I had witnessed and the creeping, inexorable understanding of what I had to do next. For I knew now that there would be no help coming, no cavalry riding to the rescue. The things that stalked the night in this forsaken wood were beyond the scope of any law or earthly authority, and having borne witness to their cruel hungers, I could no more walk away and leave others to their fates than I could sprout wings and fly. No, this burden was mine now, whether I wanted it or not. The mantle of guardian and watchman against the dark, a duty purchased with the blood of the innocents I had failed tonight, and would fail again unless I found the strength to stand against the monsters. With leaden feet, I slunk into the gore-spattered clearing to retrieve what supplies I could stomach handling. Though my entire being recoiled at the idea, I knew I needed proof of what I had seen this night, grim trophies to ward off the inevitable dismissals and accusations of madness. As I worked, a strange calm settled over me, the clarity of purpose that comes with having no other choice. I would hunt the dogmen, learn their ways and their weaknesses, and I would kill them, as many as I could, for as long as I drew breath. Not for revenge, though the temptation sang in my veins hot and seductive. No, I would take up this lonely quest so that no others would have to, so that those who ventured into these woods seeking solace or adventure need not fear the things that prowled beyond the reach of the firelight. It was a task I knew in my bones would likely be the death of me, but one I could no longer turn away from. The horrors I had witnessed tonight had carved out a space in my soul, a cold, hard void that could only be filled by the pursuit of bloody justice. And perhaps, if I was very lucky, that pursuit would lead me to some measure of redemption for the lives I had failed to save. A way to silence the screams that even now echoed in the vaults of my memory, seared into the backs of my eyelids. With a last, long look at the carnage that had once been a place of laughter and life, I gathered my grisly burdens and turned my back on all I had known. The man who strode out of that blood-soaked glade was not the same one who had walked into it, but a harsher, harder creature, forged in the fires of tragedy and tempered with grim resolve. The hunt was on, and God's help any who stood in my way, be they man or beast, for I had gazed into the abyss, and the abyss had gazed back, and blinked first. I wish I could say the years that followed were a time of bold heroics and righteous victories, that I carved a swath through the creatures of the night, leaving their corpses to rot in my wake. But the truth, as it often is, was far bleaker. Though I threw myself into the hunt with all the fervor of the lost and damned, I was ever the underdog, outmatched and overmatched by the speed and strength and cunning of my quarry. For every small triumph, every monster vanquished and life saved, there were a dozen failures, a dozen families shattered, a dozen communities left reeling in the wake of the dogmen's brutal hungers. I learned to live on the edges, eschewing human contact and companionship for the hard solace of the chase. I became a ghost. A rumor whispered around campfires, the crazy ranger who stalked the things that stalked the night. Parents invoked my name to frighten children into obedience, though I had long since stopped seeing myself as any kind of savior. The years blurred together in a haze of blood and sweat and endless, grinding pursuit. I grew lean and hard and cold, shedding the trappings of my old life like a snake sheds its skin. The man I had been before that fateful night seemed like a distant dream, a half-remembered figure from someone else's life. But no matter how many miles I logged or monsters I slew, the wounds on my soul refused to heal. The screams of the lost echoed in my dreams, mingled with the snarls of the beasts and the wet, tearing sounds of rending flesh. I took to sleeping with my knife in hand, though, whether to ward off the dangers without or within, I could no longer say. And always, the dogmen seemed to be one step ahead, darting back into the shadows just as I drew close, leaving me with nothing but another ransacked campsite and the bitter ashes of failure. It was as if they delighted in tormenting me, in dragging out my torment for their own twisted amusement. There were times, in the darkest watches of the night, when I wondered if it wouldn't be better to just let them take me, to finally lay down my weary head and allow blessed oblivion to claim me. But always, with the dawn, came the grim certainty that my work was not yet done, that there were still more lives to save, more monsters to lay low. And so I pressed on, even as the years stretched into decades and the man in the mirror became a grizzled, haunted stranger, even as the hope of true victory dwindled to a guttering spark, crowded out by the bitter certainty of a war without end. For I had made my choice that blood-soaked night, and there could be no turning back. I had taken up the mantle of guardian, of grim protector in the dark places, and I would bear it until the day my strength failed me and the creatures I hunted finally claimed their due. But I would not go quietly into that good night. I would rage against the dying of the light, for as long as breath and blood remained to me, For the lost, for the fallen, and for the small, stubborn part of me that still dared to dream of a world free from the shadow of the dogmen. It was a dream I knew I would likely never see realized. But it was one I would continue to fight for, until the very end. Because in a world gone mad, where the rules of light and dark had been rewritten in blood and horror, it was the only thing I had left to cling to, the only thing that made the long, lonely hunt worthwhile. And so I soldier on, a grim specter in the night, the last line of defense against the things that hunger in the shadows, waiting for the day when I will finally be able to lay down my burdens and rest. But until then, the hunt continues.